Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History for Deep Rest. Tonight we drift north far beyond cozy duvets and humming radiators into a place where the sea itself seems to breathe frost. You stand barefoot on a narrow wooden deck, the last light of day draining from the sky, like ink in cold water. The wind carries the sharp scent of salt and pine tar. Somewhere in the fading distance a gull cries, and the sound feels thin, brittle, almost fragile in the chill. You pull your cloak tighter, though it does very little against the creeping cold that presses through wool and into bone. This is the moment you begin to wonder how anyone survives a winter night out here. You probably will not survive this, at least not without a few tricks that these sailors know by heart. But beautiful does not mean comfortable. There is no cabin glowing with lamplight, no snug corner waiting for you to curl up. Just open deck oars resting in their locks and a mast that cuts a dark line against the twilight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, tell me your location and local time. I love imagining all of you listening from different corners of the world wrapped in warmth while we wander somewhere much colder. Now dim the lights. You shift your weight carefully as the ship tilts, again boots scraping softly against damp wood. The cold is not theatrical or dramatic, it is patient. It seeps upward from the boards through the soles of your feet. It slips down your collar, it nips at your fingertips and ears. This is a widely acknowledged historical reality of Viking Age seafaring. Longships were open vessels built for speed and flexibility, not for shelter. They were marvels of engineering in their time clinker, built with overlapping planks that gave them strength and lightness. But protection from the elements was minimal. If you sail in winter, you face winter directly. You glance toward the shoreline now, a dark silhouette. Perhaps you left it hours ago. Perhaps it lies days behind you. The water reflects the last smear of crimson in the sky, and then even that is gone. Darkness arrives quickly this far north, especially in the colder months. The air grows sharper as if the world has inhaled and decided not to exhale again. There is a temptation to imagine Vikings as impervious to discomfort, as if they strode into frost without feeling it. Yet the truth is quieter and more human. They shivered. They stamped their feet. They complained in low voices when wind whipped through the rigging. They endured because they had to, not because they were immune. One lesser-known tidbit suggests that some crews carried extra woolen cloaks specifically to wrap around themselves at night, even if those cloaks were damp with spray. It sounds miserable to us, and perhaps it was, but wool retains some insulating quality, even when wet, which makes it more forgiving than many modern fabrics you might be wearing right now. You lower yourself onto a narrow bench that runs along the hull. It is the same bench where you would sit to row knees braced back straight. At night it becomes your bed. There is no mattress, perhaps a bundle of spare clothing under your head if you are lucky. You stretch out carefully aware of the limited space. Another body lies inches from yours. The closeness is not optional, it is survival. Historians still argue whether winter voyages were common practice or reserved for urgent missions, such as trade under pressure or raids that relied on surprise. Some scholars believe that most long-distance travel avoided the harshest months when possible. Others point to sagas and archaeological clues that suggest year-round activity, especially along familiar coasts. The sea did not close for the season simply because the air turned cold. Opportunity and necessity often overruled comfort. The night deepens. You hear the soft slap of water against the hull. It has a rhythm almost hypnotic. The sail is furled now, tied securely, but it still whispers faintly when the wind shifts. Someone coughs nearby, a dry sound that lingers in the air. Another crew member mutters something about frost forming along the gunwale. You reach out and touch the wood. It already feels colder than your own skin, and that is saying something. There is no roaring fire here. No lanterns swinging cheerfully from the mast. Open flames on deck are dangerous. Tarred ropes, dry wood, tightly packed bodies. The risk of accidental blaze is too great. Any warmth must come from within, from food eaten earlier in the day, heavy with fat and grain, from muscle still warm from rowing, from shared body heat as men and perhaps women huddle shoulder to shoulder beneath layered cloaks. You notice how your breath clouds faintly in the air. It catches the starlight for a moment before fading. Above you, the sky clears, revealing a scatter of cold stars. They seem brighter in winter, as if the universe itself sharpens when the air thins. You find Orion rising low, and for a moment you feel strangely comforted. The same constellation watches over you now as it did 1,000 years ago. Your fingers tingle, then begin to ache. This is the early whisper of cold pressing inward. You flex them slowly, deliberately. Movement is life out here. Stillness invites stiffness, and stiffness can become danger. Frostbite is not a dramatic cinematic event. It begins quietly with numbness that feels almost convenient. The trick is to notice before you lose feeling entirely. The crew shifts again, adjusting positions. Someone pulls their cloak up over their nose. Another tucks hands beneath their armpits. You do the same copying instinctively. You can feel the combined warmth of bodies slowly building into the shared space, a fragile pocket of heat against the vast cold surrounding you. The longship continues forward, slicing gently through dark water. It is not fast now. It moves with patience, guided by experienced hands at the steering oar. There is trust in that quiet motion, trust in craftsmanship, trust in the people beside you, trust that dawn will eventually return. You lie back, eyes half closed, listening. The sea murmurs, the wind hums low in the rigging, the wood creaks in soft protest. It is not comfortable, but it is survivable. That is the secret. Survival here is not about conquering winter in a blaze of heroism. It is about small adjustments, layer upon layer of wool, body pressed against body, attention to wind and wave, acceptance that the cold is a companion, not an enemy you can defeat. You pull your cloak tighter once more and let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of the water. The deck beneath you is hard, the air is sharp, the night is long, and yet you remain. The wood beneath your back holds the memory of the day's weak sunlight, but that memory fades quickly. You roll onto your side and trace the line of the hull with your fingertips. The planks overlap like scales, each one fastened with iron rivets clenched tight. This is not a clumsy raft thrown together in haste. It is a deliberate design refined over generations. A commonly accepted historical understanding is that Viking longships were clinker-built, meaning their planks were laid overlapping rather than edge to edge, which gave the vessel both flexibility and strength in rough seas. That flexibility is part of why you are still afloat as winter presses in. Yet as you lie there, you cannot ignore what the ship does not provide. There is no enclosed cabin, no permanent roof above the rowing benches. The longship is essentially open from bow to stern. It is built for speed, for beaching quickly, for slipping into shallow rivers. Shelter was sacrificed for the mobility. You feel that trade-off now in the sting along your cheeks and the way the wind threads easily across the deck. You sit up slowly, careful not to jostle the person beside you. The gunwale rises only so high along the edge enough to keep waves from spilling in too easily, but not enough to block the wind entirely. When a stronger gust sweeps across the water, it curls over the side and skims the deck, brushing your ankles with icy fingers. You instinctively tuck your feet beneath you. It might surprise you to learn that some longships carried removable tents made from woolen sailcloth, which could be stretched over a simple wooden frame when the crew was at anchor. This is one of those practical details that rarely makes it into dramatic retellings. The image of fearless warriors rarely includes them carefully rigging a temporary canopy against sleet. Yet archaeological finds and saga descriptions hint that such arrangements were used especially when ships were drawn ashore for the night. The sail itself, once lowered, could become a roof of sorts. Historians continue to debate how frequently these tents were employed during actual voyages at sea. Some researchers suggest they were more common, when ships were beached providing a modest shelter on land. Others argue that even offshore crews may have improvised as cover during especially harsh weather, though stability would have been a concern. You imagine trying to secure a wool sail overhead while waves roll beneath you. It would require coordination, patience, and a willingness to fumble with stiff fingers. You rise carefully and move toward the centre of the deck. The mast stands solid, anchored into a sturdy step. Around it, the spaces open oar ports lining each side like a row of patient eyes. During the day, those ports are plugged with round wooden discs when not in use, helping to keep spray out. At night, they are sealed tight. It is a small detail, but it matters. Every gap closed means less water creeping across the boards, less ice forming where you lie. The ship's shallow draft is another quiet advantage. Because it sits relatively high in the water, it can be pulled onto a beach with collective effort. This means that whenever possible, the crew avoids spending the night drifting in open sea. Instead, they seek a cove, a sheltered inlet, a curve of shoreline that breaks the worst of the wind. It is not luxury, but it is strategy. You kneel near the edge and peer over. The sea is dark, almost oily in its stillness. Frost has begun to trace delicate patterns along the rim of the hull, thin and fragile. You brush it away with your sleeve. It flakes easily, but you know it will return before dawn. A curious tidbit sometimes mentioned by maritime archaeologists is that the curved shape of the hull could actually help conserve a small pocket of warmer air along the benches. bodies lying close against the inner curve create a kind of human-lined hollow, reducing exposure slightly compared to lying flat in open space. It is not a miracle solution, but in sub-zero conditions, even a minor reduction in airflow can make a difference. You notice how naturally the crew arranges themselves along that curve, backs pressed to wood knees bent toward the center. You settle again onto your bench, this time more aware of the ship as a living structure around you. The overlapping planks creak softly as the vessel flexes. The sound is not alarming, it is almost reassuring. A rigid ship might crack under strain. This one bends and yields, then returns to form. In winter seas, that elasticity is survival. There is, however, no insulation in the modern sense. No cork lining, no stuffed walls. The boards are thick, but wood conducts cold steadily. Over hours, it draws heat away from you. You slide a folded cloak beneath your hip, creating a thin barrier between your body and the deck. Others do the same with spare clothing or coiled ropes. It is a small act of improvisation. The smell of tar lingers faintly. The seams between planks were sealed with animal hair and tar to keep water out. That sealant helps against leaks, but it does nothing to soften the air. The scent is sharp, earthy, almost sweet beneath the salt. You breathe the mist in and imagine the hands that worked patiently to caulk every seam before the voyage began. Preparation was everything. A poorly sealed hull in winter would not just mean dampness. It could mean ice forming in the bilge weight, increasing balance shifting. You glance toward the bow, where the carved head rises in silhouette. Some ships bore dragon heads meant to intimidate enemies and ward off spirits. Whether sailors believed those carvings truly offered protection, or simply valued them as tradition, remains an open question among scholars. Historians still argue whether the fearsome figureheads were primarily psychological tools or held deeper ritual significance. As you watch the prow cut through faint ripples, it feels less like superstition and more like companionship, a guardian facing forward into the dark. The deck grows quieter. Conversations fade to murmurs, then to breathing. You listen to the rhythm of it layered with the hush of water. The ship is exposed, yes, but it is also thoughtfully constructed for the world it moves through. Its openness allows quick action. Its lightness permits beaching. Its curved hull offers slight shelter from wind. Its removable sail can become a roof when needed. You pull your cloak higher and rest your head against the wood. The Longship is not a house. It does not pretend to be one. It's a tool shaped for travel, for trade, for exploration. Surviving winter nights upon it requires adaptation rather than comfort. You are beginning to see that survival here is a mosaic of small design choices and human adjustments layered carefully like the planks beneath you. The cold remains steady and persistent, but you understand the bones of your shelter now. Sparse, yes. Vulnerable, certainly. Yet cunning in its own way. And as the ship glides onward beneath a sky sharp with stars, you feel a quiet respect for the craft that holds you above the freezing sea. You wake not because you are rested, but because the cold has found a new seam in your defences. It slips between your shoulder blades and settles there like a patient guest. The sky is still dark, though a faint paling touches the horizon. Around you the crew stirs in slow, reluctant movements. Cloaks rustle. Someone exhales sharply as they sit up, breath fogging into the dim light. Your first instinct is to move to generate warmth before stiffness takes hold. You rub your hands together, then slide them beneath your arms. The wool against your skin feels coarse but reassuring. Clothing more than any structural feature of the ship is your true shelter out here. A firmly established historical fact is that wool dominated Viking-age textiles. Sheep thrived in Scandinavian climates, and wool, unlike linen, retained insulating qualities even when damp. It was practical, accessible, and life-saving. You glance down at what you're wearing. A woolen undertunic clings close to your body, slightly scratchy but thick. Over it a heavier tunic hangs to mid-thigh. Your trousers are also wool-bound at the calves with narrow strips of cloth to keep them snug and reduce drafts. Around your shoulders, a cloak fastened with a brooch wraps you in another layer. It is not sleek or fashionable by modern standards, but it is deliberate. Each layer traps a thin pocket of air, and those pockets become barriers against the cold. A detail that often surprises people is that Viking cloaks were sometimes lined with fur, particularly among wealthier individuals. Fox sheep even bear in rare cases. The fur was turned inward, brushing the skin or inner layers of wool, adding both insulation and a certain quiet comfort. You run your fingers along the edge of your cloak and imagine that soft lining. It would make a difference on a night like this, where every breath feels sharpened by frost. Historians continue to discuss how standardized winter gear might have been across different regions of the Norse world. Some scholars argue that coastal traders from milder climates may have dressed differently than settlers pushing toward Iceland or Greenland. Others suggest that practical necessity would have driven similar solutions regardless of status or location. After all, coal does not care about social distinctions. You tug your cap lower over your ears. It is a simple knitted wool cap, nothing ornate. The top of your head radiates heat quickly, and you can feel the difference immediately when it is covered. You pull a scarf across your mouth as well, letting your breath warm the fabric before it reaches the air. The moisture from your breathing will dampen the wool slightly, but it is better than letting icy wind strike your lungs directly. Boots are your next concern. They are leather supple but sturdy, tied with thongs around the ankle. Inside you have stuffed scraps of wool to create insulation. It is a humble solution yet effective. Without it, the cold from the deck would seep into your feet within minutes. You stamp lightly, testing sensation. Toes still respond. Good. A quirky tidbit preserved in some textile studies is that certain Viking garments were dyed in surprisingly vivid colours, even in practical contexts. Reds from madder, root blues from woad. Winter clothing was not always drab and grey. Imagine a line of sailors wrapped in deep crimson cloaks against a white rim of frost. Colour did not vanish, simply because the temperature dropped. There is something almost defiant about that, a quiet insistence on beauty, even when survival is the main objective. You shift closer to the person beside you, cloak overlapping theirs. Shared warmth is subtle but real. The heat your body generates does not escape as quickly when another layer presses against it. You can feel a faint difference along your arm where fabric meets fabric. It is not cozy in the modern sense, but it reduces the edge of the cold. Layering also allows flexibility. As you begin to move about the deck, helping adjust a line stiff with frost, you can loosen your cloak slightly to prevent sweating. That balance is crucial. Overheating leads to damp clothing, and damp clothing becomes a liability once you rest again. It is a careful dance between exertion and preservation. You notice the texture of the wool more acutely in this light. It is not smooth like modern fleece. It has a lanolin scent, faintly earthy. That natural oil in wool fibres repels some moisture and contributes to its insulating properties. It also gives the fabric a slightly waxy feel when new. Over time, repeated wear softens it, but it remains sturdy. There is an ongoing scholarly conversation about how much imported fabric might have supplemented local wool. Some evidence suggests that silk and fine linens travelled along trade routes prized for status rather than practicality. Yet on a freezing longship deck, silk offers little advantage. You would trade luxury for thickness without hesitation. You pull your cloak tighter once more as a gust sweeps across the water. The fabric snaps faintly before settling. Beneath it, your layers create a cocoon of sorts, imperfect but reliable. The cold still reaches you, but it meets resistance at every stage. First the outer cloak, then the heavier tunic, then the closer layer beneath. By the time it touches your skin, its bite is dulled. You think about how much time must have gone into producing these garments. Sheep sheared in spring, wool washed carded spun into thread, looms clacking steadily as women and men alike wove lengths of fabric. It is labour transformed into warmth. Every stitch represents hours of preparation that make this moment survivable. You rub your arms briskly, feeling a circulation return more strongly. Now that you're upright, the sky lightens further, a pale band widening in the east. Frost still rims the edges of the deck, but it glitters faintly rather than hiding in shadow. Clothing does not eliminate the cold, it negotiates with it. It buys you time, it turns a deadly night into a tolerable one. And as you stand there wrapped in wool, watching breath ride in slow clouds, you realise that survival on this ship begins not with walls or fire, but with fabric carefully chosen and layered against the relentless air. You adjust your brooch, secure the fold of your cloak, and prepare for whatever the next hours bring, aware that the warmth you carry is something you wear, not something the ship provides. The light strengthens by degrees, a diluted silver spreading across the sea, and with it comes the unmistakable awareness of other bodies around you. Shoulders brush, knees press against thighs. A low murmur of waking voices blends with the hush of water against the hull. You are not alone in this cold, and that more than anything is the point. You shift closer to the man at your side, not out of affection exactly, but necessity. Cloaks overlap. Wool meets wool, the faint warmth radiating from his back reaches you through layers of fabric. It is subtle, but it is there. Human beings are walking furnaces, each of you producing heat simply by existing. On an open longship in winter, that heat becomes a shared resource. It is widely recognised that communal sleeping arrangements were normal aboard Viking vessels. Space was limited, and personal boundaries were flexible. You did not sprawl, You folded yourself into the available curve of the hull. The benches that served as rowing seats by day became narrow beds by night, and you lay shoulder to shoulder, sometimes hip to hip, forming a dense line of insulated bodies along either side of the ship. Privacy was a luxury left ashore. You tuck your hands beneath your opposite arms again, feeling your own warmth accumulate slowly. Someone behind you shifts and presses closer. The instinct to conserve heat is ancient, older than ships, older than wool cloaks. It is the same impulse that draws animals together in winter dens. Here it is not weakness, it is strategy. There is a lesser-known detail that sometimes surfaces in discussions of seafaring life. In extremely cold conditions, crews might have deliberately arranged themselves according to size and strength, placing larger individuals along the outer edge, where wind cut most sharply, while smaller or younger members lay more shielded toward the centre. Whether this was formalised or simply intuitive remains uncertain, but the logic is sound. Broad backs block drafts. Sturdier bodies absorb the brunt of exposure. Experts continue to disagree about how much hierarchy influenced these nightly arrangements. Some suggest that status would have dictated placement, with leaders occupying more protected spots. Others propose that practicality overrode rank when frostbit hard enough. When survival is at stake, ego tends to quiet down. You feel the steady rhythm of breathing around you. Inhale, exhale, a soft chorus of human warmth. It becomes almost meditative. Your own breath syncs unconsciously with those nearest to you. The air between your bodies grows slightly less sharp, held in place by overlapping cloaks and bent knees. It is a fragile microclimate, easily disrupted, yet remarkably effective. You think about how heat works. It rises, it dissipates, it escapes into open air. But when bodies cluster tightly, heat lingers. The curved hull behind you acts as a barrier, reducing airflow from one side. The person in front of you blocks wind from another. Even the sail furled and tied creates a modest obstruction amidships. The result is not comfort in the modern sense, it is survival balanced on degrees. A curious observation from experimental archaeology adds another layer to this understanding. When modern researchers have attempted to recreate Viking sleeping conditions in replica longships, they often report that shared body heat significantly improves endurance through cold nights, sometimes more effectively than additional blankets alone. The presence of another warm body can elevate the immediate surrounding temperature just enough to prevent dangerous drops in core heat. It is not dramatic, it is incremental. You rest your forehead briefly against the back of the man before you. His cloak smells faintly of smoke and salt. The scent is grounding, almost reassuring. You are reminded that every person here carries their own reserves of warmth, their own contribution to the collective shield against winter. If a cloak slips loose, cold air snakes. If a cloak slips loose, cold air snakes inward. You become aware of how often you adjust, tugging fabric tighter, tucking edges beneath the elbows or settling your position. It is a constant quiet maintenance. Endure together. You complain in low, endure together. You complain in low voices together. Someone makes a dry remark about preferring a cowshed to this floating plank, and a few soft chuckles ripple down the line. Laughter, even muted, releases tension. It does not warm your skin, but it warms something else. A continuing academic conversation revolves around the psychological resilience of Viking crews. Were they uniquely hardened by climate and culture, or simply practical people responding to harsh circumstances as any group would? The answer likely lies somewhere in between. You're not superhuman, you're adaptive. You learn that warmth can be communal, that pride yields to necessity, that survival often looks like leaning into another person's shoulder without ceremony. You flex your toes again inside your boots, reassured by the faint return of sensation. Beside you, someone shifts their cloak so that it drapes partly over your legs as well. The gesture is wordless. You reciprocate by pulling your own fabric wider, creating a shared canopy across both of you. In this small exchange, heat is traded, preserved, extended. Still rims the edges of the deck, but where the sun itself remains hidden. Frost still rims the edges of the deck, but where bodies lie close, the wood is damp rather than icy. That subtle difference speaks volumes. Heat radiates outward, changing the surface beneath you. You close your eyes for a moment, not fully asleep, but resting within the cluster of breathing forms. You realize that on this ship, warmth is not a possession. It is a collaboration. Each of you contributes a little, and together you create enough to last until dawn. When the call comes to rise and tend to the lines, you do so reluctantly but not despairingly. The night did not defeat you. It pressed in, yes. It tested every seam in your clothing and patience, but you pressed back shoulder to shoulder, breath mingling in the cold air. And as you sit up, cloak slipping from your shoulders, you understand that the most reliable shelter on this open deck is not wood or sailcloth, It is the living, breathing wall formed by the people around you. The first real wave of the morning does not announce itself with drama. It simply rises a little higher than the others and spills across the side in a sheet of icy spray. You flinch as it strikes your boots and soaks the lower edge of your cloak. The water is not merely cold, it is numbing as if it carries winter itself dissolved within it. Winter. Those droplets do not evaporate. Winter, those droplets do not evaporate quickly. They linger, bead along rope fibres and freeze into thin crust of ice. A well-documented maritime reality is that saltwater exposure in freezing temperatures creates layers of ice that can add weight to a ship and stiffen its working parts. On a longship where agility and balance matter deeply, that accumulation must be managed constantly. You wipe your sleeve across your face, tasting salt on your lips. It leaves a faint sting. The wood beneath your feet glistens where water has just spread. Already you can see the beginnings of a fragile sheen forming along the edges. You bend down and scrape it with the side of your boot before it hardens further. Ropes are your next concern. The rigging, though simpler than on later sailing ships, still depends on flexible lines. Hemp stiffens when wet and frozen. If left unattended, it can become unyielding, difficult to knot or release. You move toward the mast with another crew member flexing your fingers before gripping a line. It is slick and cold but not yet solid. You run it through your hands, encouraging movement, preventing it from locking into place. There is a practical detail sometimes overlooked in romantic portrayals of Viking voyages. Crews likely carried spare lines and tools specifically because winter conditions could degrade equipment quickly. Tarred rope resisted moisture better than untreated fibre, but nothing was immune. Maintenance was not optional, it was woven into daily routine. The salt itself adds a curious layer to this struggle. Salt lowers the freezing point of water, which means that brine does not solidify as quickly as fresh water. That slight chemical advantage can delay the formation of ice, buying you time. Yet when it does freeze, it forms a crust that is rough and abrasive. You feel it under your palm as you brush along the gunwale, tiny crystals biting at your skin. Researchers who have reconstructed Viking ships and sailed them in cold climates often remark on how quickly spray can chill a crew to the core. Even if air temperature hovers just below freezing, wind combined with wet clothing accelerates heat loss dramatically. You feel that now as the damp hem of your cloak clings to your leg. You shake it out and adjust it higher, mindful of keeping inner layers dry. A small but fascinating observation from experimental voyages is that crews sometimes rotated positions not only for rowing but to distribute exposure. Those nearer the bow endured more spray. Those amidships faced less direct soaking, but perhaps more wind from open sides. By shifting roles, the burden was shared. Whether Viking crews followed a formal schedule for this or relied on informal understanding remains a subject of discussion among historians. What seems clear is that no one could remain perpetually in the harshest position without consequence. Another wave strikes lighter this time. The deck tilts gently beneath you. You widen your stance instinctively, knees soft. Balance matters when surfaces grow slick. A misstep in freezing conditions can mean more than bruised pride. Falling into the sea at this temperature would sap your strength with terrifying speed. There is an unusual tidbit preserved in some saga literature describing sailors rubbing animal fat into exposed skin as a partial barrier against wind and moisture. While it may sound unpleasant to modern sensibilities, grease can provide a degree of protection, reducing direct contact between icy air and flesh. Whether this practice was widespread or occasional is unclear, but the logic is straightforward. Out here, practicality outweighs elegance. You glance toward the horizon. The sky has brightened to a muted grey-blue, yet the sun remains hidden behind low clouds, light without warmth. The wind shifts slightly, and with it comes a sharper bite. You pull your cloak tighter again, grateful for the wall's resilience. The wood of the deck darkens where water spreads. Beneath your boots you feel the slight give of planks flexing with each swell. That flexibility so admired in ship design also means that pooled water finds shallow depressions to gather in. You grab a small wooden scoop and begin to push the brine toward the side, sending it back into the sea before it can freeze solid. It is repetitive work, almost meditative. Scholars continue to explore how Viking crews balance speed with safety during winter travel. Some propose that they would have hugged coastlines more closely in cold months, reducing exposure to open ocean spray. Others suggest that experienced navigators could manage longer crossings, even in harsh conditions, relying on skill and preparation. As you stand here scraping frost and pushing water overboard, you understand that theory meets reality in small, relentless tasks. Your fingers ache as circulation fluctuates between numbness and sting. You pause briefly to tuck them under your arms, again warming them before returning to the ropes. Around you others perform similar rituals. Flex, warm, work, repeat. The rhythm becomes second nature. The smell of salt intensifies as wind carries spray across the deck once more. It mingles with tar and damp wool, creating a scent that is both bracing and strangely comforting. This is the smell of endurance, of effort layered upon effort. You think about how different this would feel without preparation, without layered clothing, without practiced hands to tend lines and clear ice. The Longship offers no walls, no permanent shield. Instead, survival emerges from vigilance, from noticing the thin glaze of frost before it thickens, from drying a hem before it soaks through, from keeping ropes supple and decks clear. Another wave rolls beneath you, lifting the hull gently. The sea is not raging yet, it never fully rests. You adjust your footing once more and breathe deeply, letting the cold air fill your lungs despite its bite. The spray will return, the salt will crust again. Your cloak will dampen and dry in cycles. This is the quiet contest of winter at sea. Not a single dramatic confrontation, but a steady exchange between water and wood, between cold and the warmth you guard so carefully. And as you continue to scrape ring and adjust, you realize that survival on freezing nights is not only about enduring darkness, it is about managing the sea itself, one shimmering sheet of brine at a time. The sea settles into a slower rhythm as the morning stretches on, but relief does not mean rest. Even in daylight, vigilance governs your movements. Winter nights may be the harshest test, yet the hours before and after them demand structure. Without it, fatigue would creep in quietly and erode your strength long before frost ever could. You rub your eyes and glance toward the stern where the steering oar rests in steady hands. No one simply collapses into sleep all at once. A dependable feature of seafaring life in the Viking Age was the use of watches rotating periods of alertness that ensured someone was always attentive to wind current and approaching hazards. This was not a luxury system, it was essential. A drifting longship at night, even in seemingly calm waters, could find itself driven toward rocks or ice-edged shallows if left unattended. You listen as a low voice announces the change. It is not shouted. It does not need to be. The crew understands the rhythm. Those who kept the later watch step back, shoulders, stiff eyes rimmed with tiredness. Others rise to take their place. You feel the weight of your own turn approaching. Rest is always partial out here, a borrowed thing that must be repaid. You move toward the center of the deck, flexing your hands again. The wind has shifted slightly and you can sense the subtle adjustment in the sail, though it remains furled for now. The air carries a different edge, almost metallic. You inhale slowly, letting the cold sharpen your awareness. It is broadly accepted that Viking crews were highly disciplined when at sea, despite popular images of chaos and bravado. Seamanship required coordination. Oars had to move in unison. Lines had to be secured properly. Night watches demanded trust. If one person failed to stay alert, everyone risked the consequences. You feel that collective responsibility settle over you as naturally as your call or cloak. A lesser-known detail sometimes mentioned in reconstructions of Viking voyages is that songs or quiet chants may have been used not only for rowing but also to maintain wakefulness during long hours of watch. A steady murmur barely louder than the wind could keep the mind engaged and stave off the heavy pull of sleep. You imagine a low hum passing between sailors, not celebratory, but steady like a heartbeat carried on breath. When your turn arrives, you step closer to the side of the ship, eyes scanning the dark water ahead. Even in daylight, winter seas can conceal floating debris or thin sheets of ice drifting from colder inlets. Your task is not dramatic heroism, it is observation. The art of noticing small changes in the texture of the water or the line of the horizon. There is ongoing discussion among maritime historians about how formalized these watch systems might have been. Some suggest that smaller crews operated more informally, relying on shared awareness rather than strict rotation. Others believe that voyages of trade or exploration demanded clearer structure, especially in winter, when daylight was limited and night stretched long. As you stand here fighting the heaviness behind your eyes, you suspect that some pattern, whether written or simply understood, must have governed the shifts. Chaos would not suffice in this cold. Beside you, another crew member shifts his one. Tin han lại báo hồn rồi. Cháu, số cơ phải bật hồn. Cũng vô nha. More to the home. Out now, Captain Doctor. Beside you, another crew member shifts his weight and leans slightly into the wind, scanning a different angle of the sea. The two of you share the burden without speaking. Fatigue in winter is different from summer weariness. It is deeper edged with chill. Your body burns more energy simply to stay warm, which means you tire more quickly. Food helps, yes, but sleep is fractured by cold and rotation. You feel it in your muscles, a quiet ache layered beneath the sharper sting of wind. A curious anecdote preserved in later Scandinavian folklore tells of sailors splashing cold seawater on their faces deliberately to remain alert during night watches. It sounds counterintuitive, almost cruel, yet the shock of icy brine would certainly jolt the senses awake. Whether this practice dates reliably to the Viking Age is uncertain, but the logic aligns with the conditions you're experiencing. Out here, comfort is secondary to alertness. You adjust your cloak once more, ensuring it does not obstruct your view. The furled sail creaks faintly above ropes tapping lightly against the mast. Every sound carries farther in cold air. You learn to distinguish the normal language of the ship from unfamiliar noises. A steady creak is reassuring. A sudden crack demands attention. As the hours pass, you begin to sense a quiet pride in this shared endurance. The watch is not glamorous. No saga will dwell on the man who simply stood and stared into grey water for hours. Yet without him, without you, the voyage would falter. Survival in winter depends not only on warmth and shelter, but on structure, on the certainty that someone is awake when others cannot be. When your shift ends, relief washes over you, though it is muted. You step back, shoulders sagging slightly, and allow another to take your place. There is no ceremony in the exchange, just a nod, a brief meeting of eyes, a silent acknowledgement of trust. You return to your narrow bench and lower yourself carefully. The deck still feels cold, but now fatigue dulls its edge. You draw your cloak around you once more and settle into the curve of the hull. Around you the rhythm continues. Watch changes, wind shifts, water murmurs. You close your eyes and let the ship's motion cradle you, gently aware that even as you drift, someone else stands guard against the dark and the cold beyond the gunwale. And in that quiet rotation night after night, you understand that survival is not a single act of endurance. It is a system carefully maintained one watch at a time. When the wind slackens toward an evening, the sail comes down with a soft, heavy sigh. It is thicker than you might expect densely woven wool that has endured salt strain and sun. As it is lowered carefully and gathered along the deck, you begin to see it differently. Not merely as a tool for movement, but as potential shelter. The air grows sharper again as daylight thins. You feel the familiar tightening in your shoulders, the anticipation of another long night. But this time there is activity beyond the usual settling into benches. A few crew members move with deliberate purpose, retrieving short wooden supports and lengths of cord. You recognize the pattern. Tonight you will attempt a small improvement against the cold. It is well established that Viking sails were made of wool often treated with animal fat or other substances to make them more resistant to water. This made them heavy but durable. When lowered, that same thickness offered more than just fabric. It could become a barrier against wind if arranged properly. You help lift one edge, feeling its weight in your hands. Even damp, it holds warmth better than bare air. The men work quietly, fitting the short poles into place along the central line of the ship. The mast serves as an anchor point. The sail is draped across the supports, creating a low canopy over part of the deck. It does not cover the entire vessel. That would be impractical and potentially dangerous if a sudden manoeuvre were required. Instead, it forms a modest tent over the area where most of you will lie. You step back to assess the shape. It is uneven, slightly sagging at one corner, but it breaks the direct path of the wind. Already you notice a difference. The air beneath the wool feels less biting, more contained. It is not warm exactly, but it is shielded. There has long been discussion among maritime historians about how often such arrangements were used while still afloat. Some argue that crews preferred to beach the ship before erecting any kind of covering, reducing the risk of instability. Others contend that in relatively calm waters, a low-sail tent could be managed safely, especially if the vessel was at anchor. As you watch the edges secured carefully, you sense that this is a compromise between exposure and caution. A small and rather charming detail found in some saga accounts describes sailors decorating the interior of temporary sail shelters with personal items when wintering. Ashore, creating a semblance of domestic space. Whether this extended to brief nights at sea is unclear, but the instinct to soften harsh surroundings seems universal. Even here, someone hangs a small pouch from a rope near their bench, keeping it within reach under the canopy. A faint scent of lanolin and sea salt. You duck slightly as you step beneath the woolen roof. The light shifts immediately dimmer and more intimate. The sail carries a faint scent of lanolin and sea salt. You brush your fingers along its underside and feel the tight weave. It blocks not only wind, but also drifting spray which would otherwise settle directly on your face through the night. The soundscape changes as well. Outside the canopy, the wind still whispers across open planks. Beneath it, the noise dulls, softened by the thick fabric. Voices sound closer, more contained. The space feels communal in a new way, as if you have stepped into a shared room rather than lying scattered along an exposed deck. Of course, there are drawbacks. Condensation forms more easily when warm breath meets cooler fabric above. You notice faint droplets beginning to gather on the inner surface of the sail. If too much moisture accumulates, it could drip back down. Careful ventilation becomes necessary. A small gap is left along one side to allow airflow without inviting the full force of the wind. Researchers who have experimented with replica ships often remark on this balance. Too much enclosure leads to dampness and stale air. Too little leaves bodies fully exposed. The ideal arrangement depends on wind strength, temperature, and the steadiness of the sea. There is no fixed formula, only experience. Woolen roof traps. Some of the collective woolen roof traps, some of the collective warmth rising from your bodies. You can feel it faintly against your cheeks. It is subtle but unmistakable. A lingering scholarly disagreement concerns whether specialized winter coverings were ever crafted beyond the sail itself. Some propose that additional textiles may have been carried for colder voyages, while others argue that cargo space was too precious for such luxuries. As you lie here with the sail serving double duty, you suspect that practicality guided decisions more often than comfort. Outside, the sky darkens fully. The sea continues its patient movement, lifting and lowering the hull. Beneath the canopy, the motion feels slightly more secure, as if the ship itself has drawn its shoulders in against the night. You listen to the muffled creak of wood and the gentle tap of rope against mast. The sail above shifts faintly with each gust, but it holds. The edges remain tied, the support steady. There is a quiet satisfaction in this small act of adaptation. You have not built walls, you have not conquered the cold, you have simply redirected it. A soft murmur passes through the group, a few low words exchanged about the improved comfort. Someone jokes that it feels almost like a hall at home, though far smaller and far colder. A few muted chuckles follow. Even humour seems warmer beneath the woolen roof. You draw your cloak closer and settle into the curve of the hull once more. The canopy does not eliminate the chill, but it blunts its sharpest edge. The air feels less restless, less invasive. Your breath lingers slightly longer before dissipating. As your eyes close, you become aware of how ingenuity replaces architecture on this ship. There are no permanent cabins, no carved beams forming snug corners. Instead, there is fabric repurposed poles fitted into place edges tied with careful knots. Shelter here is temporary, flexible, responsive to conditions. The night deepens, but this time it presses against wool rather than directly against your skin. And in that modest difference, you find a measure of relief, a small pocket of humanity suspended above the freezing sea. By the time the next evening approaches, you can sense a collective decision forming, even before it is spoken aloud. The wind has shifted unfavourably, carrying a sharper chill from open water, and the swell has grown slightly more insistent. The coastline, faint but visible through the grey haze, offers something the deck never truly can. Stability. The order is given quietly. Oars slide back into their locks. Hands grip worn shafts, polished smooth by years of use. You take your place, bracing your boots against the crossbeam. The rhythm begins steady and measured. Wood dips into dark water. Muscles strain in unison. The shoreline grows nearer, revealing a low crescent of sand framed by dark pines dusted with frost. One firmly grounded historical reality is that Viking longships were deliberately designed to be beached. Their shallow draft and symmetrical bow and stern allowed them to approach land directly without the need for docks or harbours. This capability was not just strategic in raids, it was essential for survival in harsh weather. You feel the advantage now as the hull glides toward the shallows. The keel scrapes lightly against sand. There is a gentle jolt, then stillness. You exhale without realizing you are holding your breath. The sea continues its movement beyond the bow, but beneath you the ground is solid. Ropes are thrown, anchors set to secure the ship against shifting tide. Then comes the heavier work. Together you push. Boots sink into damp sand as shoulders lean against the hull. The Longship, so graceful in water, resists slightly at first. Then it slides forward inch by inch until more of its belly rests above the tide line. The effort warms you in a way the sea never quite can. Your breath clouds thickly in the air, but your muscles hum with heat. There is something deeply reassuring about sleeping on land, even if that land is frozen and unforgiving. The ground does not tilt. It does not heave beneath you in the dark. The psychological relief alone feels substantial. Scholars continue to examine how frequently wintering crews sought shelter ashore during voyages. While continuous sea travel was possible, many historians believe that coastal routes were favoured precisely because they allowed regular landfall. You understand why. A lesser-known detail drawn from archaeological findings suggests that temporary camps near beached ships sometimes included low windbreaks built from driftwood or stones. Nothing elaborate, just enough to disrupt the direct force of coastal gusts. You gather fallen branches with others and arrange them along one side of the ship, creating a modest barrier. It looks almost fragile, yet when you stand behind it you notice the difference immediately. The sail canopy is erected again, this time with greater confidence. Without the motion of waves, the structure feels steadier. Beneath it, the sand is firm and cold. Some of you spread spare cloaks or woven blankets directly on the ground to create a thin buffer between body and earth. The ship itself forms one side of your shelter, its curved hull blocking wind from that direction. There has been ongoing academic conversation about whether fires were more safely lit when ships were beached. The risk of sparks catching tarred wood was reduced on land, but caution remained necessary. You see a small pit dug a short distance from the hull stones, arranged carefully around its edge. Dry twigs are added, then thicker pieces of wood. A spark catches, a flame flickers. The sight of fire in winter is almost hypnotic. It throws a trembling glow across faces and hull alike. You extend your hands toward it, feeling warmth seep into your stiff fingers. The crackle of burning wood replaces the hush of waves as the dominant sound. Smoke rises straight up at first, then drifts toward the trees. An intriguing anecdote found in some regional traditions describes sailors warming stones in such fires and then placing them near sleeping areas to radiate heat through the night. Whether this was common practice among Viking crews is uncertain, yet the idea is practical. You notice one of the men placing a heated stone near the edge of the canopy, careful not to let it touch fabric. It emits a faint warmth that lingers even as the flames settle lower. You sit back on your heels and watch the sky darken beyond the pines. The sea still murmurs, but at a distance now. The contrast between floating and grounded existence feels profound. On the water, survival required constant balance. Here the earth absorbs your weight without protest. Experts have long discussed the seasonal patterns of Viking exploration and trade. Some evidence suggests that while major expeditions favoured warmer months, winter travel was not unheard of, especially along familiar coasts. Settlements in Iceland and Greenland, for example, demanded resilience year-round. You imagine those harsher landscapes and feel a quiet respect for anyone who called them home. The fire dwindles to glowing embers as night fully claims the sky. You retreat beneath the sail canopy as sand cool beneath your layered clothing. The windbreak of branches softens the gusts that slip between trees. The ship looms beside you, a dark silhouette against faint starlight. You lie down and stretch your legs more freely than you could at sea. The simple ability to shift without fear of tipping feels luxurious. Around you others settle in similar relief. The warmth from the heated stone near your feet fades gradually, but it leaves behind a memory in your skin. The cold remains. It always does. Yet anchored to land, shielded by hull and branches, warmed by embers and shared breath, the night feels less hostile. You close your eyes and listen to the distant surf rather than the immediate slap against planks. Survival has shifted again, not through grand invention, but through proximity to shore. The Longship rests patiently above the tide and you rest beside it, grounded at last, carrying the quiet understanding that sometimes the best shelter is simply choosing where to stop. The embers from last night's fire glow faintly beneath a skin of pale ash. You crouch beside them at dawn, cupping your hands and breathing gently until a thread of orange brightens again. A small flame catches, hesitant at first, then steadier, as you feed it dry twigs gathered from beneath the trees. The warmth spreads outward in a slow, grateful bloom. Fire is both comfort and risk. On land it feels like a gift. On the deck of a tar-sealed wooden ship it becomes a danger that must be treated with near reverence. It is widely understood that Viking longships were coated with tar to waterproof their planks. That same tar, invaluable against leaks, would burn readily if sparked. You imagine a stray ember landing on a rope or seam and you shiver for reasons that have nothing to do with temperature. Because of this, open flames aboard ship were likely kept to a minimum. Scholars examining Norse maritime practice often note the absence of built-in hearths on longships. These were not floating homes, they were vehicles. Cooking and larger fires were typically reserved for when the vessel was safely ashore. You can see the logic plainly now as you warm your hands over the growing blaze, grateful that sand lies between the flames and the hull. There has been a quiet but persistent debate about whether small portable braziers might have been used occasionally on deck during extreme cold. Some archaeological Tabdyuk sites have yielded fire pans in other contexts, leading a few researchers to speculate that controlled heat sources could have travelled aboard certain ships. Others remain sceptical, pointing out the obvious hazard in cramped windswept conditions. As you glance at the sail canopy only a few paces away, you lean toward caution. It would take very little for warmth to turn catastrophic. A curious anecdote preserved in later northern folklore tells of sailors placing a small shield over embers to protect them from wind while heating a pot. Whether that practice stretches back reliably to the Viking Age is uncertain, yet the image is vivid. A shield symbol of battle repurposed as a guard for fragile fire. You can almost see it now, wood and iron rim reflecting orange light. You feed the flames carefully, adding thicker branches once the smaller ones burn cleanly. Soon a modest but steady fire crackles within the ring of stones. A simple iron pot is hung above it, suspended from a wooden frame hastily assembled. Inside, water begins to warm. Perhaps dried meat will be added, or grain to create a thin porridge. Even the promise of warm liquid feels transformative after nights of chilled breath. The smell of smoke mingles with salt and pine. It clings to your cloak and hair. Smoke in winter is more than scent. It is reassurance. It tells you that you can push back against cold, at least in small circles. When the pot begins to steam, you lift it carefully and pass it among the crew. Each person cups it briefly, letting heat seep into the shinkerts before taking a cautious sip. The liquid is not rich or elaborate, but it is hot. That alone sends warmth downward into your chest and stomach. Calories matter here. Sustenance fuels the internal furnace that keeps you alive when wool and closeness are not enough. Researchers studying Viking diet have confirmed that preserved foods were essential for winter travel. Dried fish, smoked meat, hard bread, fermented dairy. These provisions were portable and resistant to spoilage. Fresh food was scarce at sea in colder months. You chew slowly, aware that each bite is an investment in the coming night. As the morning advances, the fire is reduced deliberately. You do not let it rage unchecked. Wood is valuable. Control is necessary. Before leaving this sheltered shore, the embers will be extinguished fully, sand poured over them until no glow remains. Carelessness could ignite brush or driftwood, and while you might escape quickly, by pushing the ship back into water, the damage left behind would linger. There is also a rhythm to when fire is used. Not constantly, not indulgently, but strategically. Morning warmth to restore feeling. Evening flame to prepare food, and perhaps heat stones again for the night. In between, reliance returns to clothing and human proximity. Some historians have noted that the ability to produce fire reliably was so fundamental to Norse life that it shaped settlement patterns as much as agriculture did. Driftwood along coasts, peat in certain regions, forested inland valleys. Fuel sources mattered. As you glance toward the tree line, you are aware that this sheltered cove offers more than protection from wind. It offers wood. You rise and stretch, feeling heat lingering in your core from the broth. The ship rests quietly on sand hull, dark against pale shore. You walk its length, inspecting planks and seams. The cold night does not split anything. The tar holds firm, ropes remain intact. The absence of fire damage is its own quiet victory. When it is time to depart, the fire is smothered thoroughly. Ashes scattered, stones are returned to their place, and there is no trace left but faint warmth in the sand. The sail canopy is dismantled, folded, carefully restored to its primary role. As the longship is pushed once more toward the water, you cast a final glance at the spot where flames flickered hours earlier. On land, fire is a companion. At sea, it is a memory carried in your muscles and belly rather than in open flame. You step aboard and feel the subtle shift as the hull lifts free of sand. The sea embraces you, again cold and patient. There will be no crackling fire tonight on deck. Instead, you will carry warmth within layers of wool and within your own body, fed by the meal you shared. The lesson is clear and steady. Fire is power, but it must be placed wisely. On a winter longship, wisdom often means restraint. The warmth from the morning broth lingers as you settle back into your place along the bench. It radiates outward from your stomach in a slow, steady glow, subtle but meaningful. In winter, food is not simply sustenance. It is fuel measured carefully against the cold. The longship moves again through grey water, and you feel the familiar rhythm return beneath your boots. Someone unwraps a bundle near you, revealing strips of dried fish, stiff and pale. Another passes around hard bread, dense and unyielding. You take a piece and bite down slowly. It resists at first, then softens with effort. It's well documented that Viking crews relied heavily on preserved foods during voyages, especially in colder months. Fresh produce would not last long in damp shifting conditions. Instead, they carried what could endure. Stockfish air-dried cod hardened by northern winds, smoked meats treated with salt, barley bread baked firm to resist mould. These foods were practical, durable, rich in calories, which mattered more than culinary pleasure. You chew methodically, aware of the effort required even to eat. Your jaw works against the dryness. Someone beside you dips their bread briefly in a small cup of leftover broth to soften it. You follow suit and the texture yields more easily. Fat is especially prized. Animal fat, whether from pork, beef or fish, burns hot within the body. In freezing conditions, that internal fire can mean the difference between shivering endlessly and maintaining stable warmth. You swallow and feel a renewed steadiness in your limbs. There is a modest but intriguing detail found in some Norse sources suggesting that fermented dairy products such as skyr may have travelled aboard ships when possible. Thick and tangy skirt provided protein and energy. Whether it was commonly carried on long winter voyages remains uncertain, as its storage posed challenges. Still, the possibility adds texture to your understanding of their diet. It was not entirely monotonous, even if options were limited. The wind shifts slightly and you pull your cloak tighter while continuing to eat. Around you, the act of chewing becomes communal, almost synchronized. Food passed hand to hand reinforces the same shared resilience you felt beneath the sail canopy. Scholars continue to examine how nutritional strategies influence the success of Norse expansion. Some argue that their ability to preserve high-energy foods gave them an advantage in colder climates compared to other medieval groups. Others caution against overstating this factor, noting that many northern societies developed similar techniques. As you sit here gnawing on dried fish, the debate feels distant. What matters is the immediate warmth spreading through your core. A small, almost amusing anecdote recorded in later Icelandic writing mentioned sailors soaking particularly tough dried fish in seawater briefly to soften it before eating. It sounds counterintuitive to modern ears, adding salt to an already salty meal. Yet the moisture would have made it easier to chew. You consider trying it, but decide against dipping your food into the frigid sea today. Water itself presents another challenge. Fresh water must be carried in barrels protected from contamination and freezing. In extreme cold, barrels can ice over, requiring careful thawing near a controlled fire when ashore. You take a cautious sip from a wooden cup, aware of how precious it is. Dehydration creeps quietly in cold air, masked by the absence of sweat. The act of eating also structures time. In winter, daylight is brief. Meals mark the passage of hours as much as the sun does. You notice how conversation briefly rises during food distribution, then fades again as chewing replaces speech. There has also been discussion among historians about whether certain voyages included limited hunting or fishing even during winter travel. Nets and lines could provide fresh catch if conditions allowed. However, reliance on preserved stores was safer. The sea in winter is unpredictable and you cannot depend on daily harvests. You finish your portion, slowly brushing crumbs from your cloak. Your stomach feels heavier now, not uncomfortably so, but solid. That solidity translates into steadier hands and clearer thought. Calories transform into heat invisibly, like a hidden hearth within your chest. The cold still surrounds you. The wind still cuts along the gunwale, yet with food inside you the edge softens. You feel less fragile, more anchored within your own body. A final observation from researchers studying Viking life suggests that communal eating reinforced bonds as much as it sustained bodies. Shared hardship paired with shared meals created cohesion that was vital for survival at sea. You sense that truth in the quiet exchanges around you. A piece of bread offered without words, a nod of thanks, a brief half-smile. As the longship continues its patient journey, you lean back against the curve of the hull once more. Your breath no longer trembles quite as sharply. The energy from the meal settles into muscle and bone. Winter nights will return, spray will freeze along the edges again. But with each ration carefully consumed, you build another layer of defense, not of wool or wood, but of warmth generated from within. You wipe your hands on a scrap of cloth and gaze toward the dim horizon. Survival here is not dramatic. It is cumulative. A mouthful of dried fish, a swallow of warm broth, a shared crust of bread. More you have grown accustomed to the rhythm of preparation. The sail is lowered, lines secured, loose objects tucked into safer positions. The sky fades from grey to a muted violet, and the temperature follows, slipping downward with quiet determination. You move toward your usual place, along the hull, running your hand along the inner curve of the planks. The Longships design reveals itself most clearly at night, when function becomes comfort by necessity. The sides rise just high enough to break the lowest sweep of wind. The benches run lengthwise parallel to the keel, creating narrow but continuous sleeping spaces. There are no separate bunks, no assigned rooms, just the shared architecture of wood and space. It's a widely recognised feature of Viking longships that they were built with symmetry in mind. Bow and stern mirrored each other, allowing the vessel to reverse direction without turning in tight spaces. That symmetry also meant there was no distinctly superior sleeping area. Shelter depended more on wind direction and personal position than on status. You lower yourself carefully onto the bench and stretch out along the narrow span. Your back presses against the curve of the hull. Your knees bend slightly to fit the limited length. The deck beneath you feels firm and unyielding, but after several nights your body has adapted. The initial shock of hardness has softened into familiarity. Cold air sinks, yes, but when bodies line the sides and generate heat, that warmth lingers briefly against the wood before drifting upward. It is a minor advantage, yet in freezing conditions, even a minor advantage matters. You tuck your cloak beneath your hips, creating a small barrier between yourself and the chilled planks. Someone beside you does the same. Another folds a spare garment into a makeshift pillow. The adjustments are small and personal. Each person refines their position over time, learning to which angle preserves the most warmth, which arrangement keeps drafts from slipping through. There has been thoughtful discussion among historians about how much sleep Viking crews actually managed during extended voyages. Fragmented rest seems likely. Rotating watches, cold interruptions, shifting weather. Some scholars suggest that sailors developed a tolerance for shorter sleep cycles, compensating with brief periods of deeper rest when conditions allowed. As you lie here listening to the sea, you understand that sleep is not abundant. It is negotiated. You draw your knees closer to your chest and angle your back more firmly against the hull. The wood feels cold at first contact, but your body begins to warm it gradually. The process is slow, almost imperceptible. You imagine dozens of nights like this, heat absorbed and released. A curious anecdote found in a later Nordic tale describes sailors marking their preferred sleeping spots with small personal tokens when wintering ashore, staking claim to familiarity even in communal space. Whether such habits existed aboard ship is uncertain, but you notice how people gravitate consistently to similar positions each night. Habit breeds comfort. The sail canopy is not raised this evening. The sea is calm enough that the crew chooses to keep the deck clear, ready for quick adjustments if wind shifts. Without the woolen roof, the stars appear brighter overhead. You watch them for a moment before pulling your cloak higher. Your boots remain on. Removing them would expose your feet to air that steals warmth rapidly. You loosen them slightly to ease pressure but keep the layers intact. Socks of wool remain snug against your skin. An ongoing scholarly conversation explores whether straw or additional padding was ever carried aboard for sleeping. Evidence suggests that space constraints limited such luxuries on active voyages. Cargo weapons and essential tools took priority. Comfort was secondary. As you rest your head on your bundled cloak, you suspect that any extra material would have been precious indeed. The sounds of the ship become your lullaby. The low creak of planks flexing, the soft slap of water against the hull, the faint whistle of wind through the rigging. Each noise is familiar now. You have learned which sounds signal danger and which are simply the language of a living vessel. Someone shifts beside you, brushing your elbow. You respond by adjusting slightly, creating room without fully separating. The shared boundary remains intact. Heat passes quietly between you. Your breath slows gradually. The cold remains present, pressing gently against exposed skin, but your layers blunt its sharpest edges. The food you ate earlier continues to burn within you, supporting your body's silent effort to maintain balance. There is a quiet resilience in this arrangement. No feather mattress, no enclosed chamber, just wood, wool, and proximity. Yet night after night it proves sufficient. As you close your eyes, you feel the subtle sway of the hull beneath you, even in calm water. It is no longer disorienting. It is almost soothing. The ship holds you in its narrow embrace, curved sides sheltering just enough benches, offering just enough space. Sleep comes not as a grand surrender, but as a gradual dimming of awareness. Your last conscious thought lingers on the simplicity of it all. Survival here is not built on grand structures. It is shaped by design choices made long before you boarded, by planks laid with care, by benches spaced with intention, by a hull curved to slice through water and incidentally cradle those who lie against it. Before dawn, you wake to a new sound. Not before dawn you wake to a new sound, not the slap of water or the murmur of wind, but something softer, a faint persistent whisper against fabric. You blink upward and feel a cool touch on your cheek. Snow. It arrives quietly sifting down through the dark like ash from an invisible fire. The flakes land on the deck onto cloaks along the rim of the hull. At first, they melt on contact with your body heat, leaving small damp spots. But as the snowfall thickens, the deck begins to pale. You sit up slowly, brushing your shoulders clear. Around you, others stir as well. The world has changed colour overnight. The sea remains dark beyond the gunwale, but the ship itself is dusted in white. It is a widely acknowledged reality that snowfall was an expected companion of winter voyages in northern waters. Scandinavian winters were not merely cold, but often laden with precipitation that could shift rapidly between sleet snow and freezing rain. For sailors on open vessels, this added a new layer of management to already demanding conditions. You rise carefully, boots crunching softly against the accumulating layer. Snow, unlike spray, arrives dry and almost gentle, yet it carries its own risk. Left unchecked, it gathers weight. On a longship, balance matters. Even a modest accumulation along one side can alter how the vessel rides the water. You pick up a wooden scoop and begin pushing snow toward the edge, sending it overboard in small cascades. The motion feels almost peaceful. The flakes cling lightly to rope and wood, outlining every seam and rivet. The carved prow looks softer beneath its white cap, less fearsome, almost contemplative. There is an interesting note from experimental sailing groups who have taken replica longships into winter conditions. They report that snow can act as a brief insulator when dry, forming a thin barrier against direct wind on deck. However, once compacted or partially melted, it turns into icy slush that saps warmth quickly. The difference between helpful and harmful lies in timing. You notice how the snow behaves differently, depending on where it lands. On open planks exposed to wind, it blows away in fine drifts. Beneath your cloak, it melts almost instantly. Along the sail, still furled tightly against the mast, it gathers in shallow folds. Scholars continue to examine how Norse crews adapted to varying winter weather patterns, particularly in regions like the North Atlantic, where sudden squalls were common. Some researchers suggest that experienced navigators would have monitored cloud formations and wind shifts closely to anticipate snowfall. Others point out that winter storms could appear with little warning, leaving crews to respond in real time. As you glance at the grey sky, heavy and indistinct, you suspect that prediction was often an imperfect art. A lesser-known observation from archaeological textiles reveals that tightly woven wool resists snow penetration surprisingly well when dry. The flakes rest on the surface rather than sinking in immediately. You test this by brushing your cloak sleeve. The snow scatters easily, leaving the wool only slightly damp. Still, vigilance remains necessary. You move toward the stern and clear snow from around the steering oar. A frozen handle would compromise control. Another crew member checks the oar ports, ensuring that plugs remain secure. Snow drifting into the interior could melt later and refreeze in awkward places. The atmosphere feels muffled now. Sound carries differently when snow falls. The sea's murmur softens as if wrapped in wool itself. Your own movements seem quieter, boots pressing into powder with a subdued crunch. There has been thoughtful discussion among historians about whether winter voyages were sometimes intentionally timed to take advantage of frozen waterways along certain coasts. In shallow regions, thin ice could form near shore, complicating navigation. Whether Viking crews exploited or avoided such conditions remains debated. You imagine steering through slushy inlets, pushing aside fragile sheets of ice with oars. A small anecdote preserved in a later Icelandic chronicle tells of sailors shaking snow from their cloaks before entering communal halls to prevent puddles forming on floors. It is a mundane detail, yet it reflects an awareness of snow's dual nature, gentle in descent, disruptive in accumulation. As the snowfall eases, the ship gleams faintly beneath its white covering. The deck feels brighter, reflecting what little light filters through the clouds. You pause for a moment and look around. The cold remains sharp, but the scene carries a strange beauty. The dark wood outlined in frost, the sea breathing steadily beyond. You stamp your feet to keep circulation strong and resume clearing. Snow overboard, snow from ropes, snow from the base of the mast. The repetitive motion warms your arms. Breath rises in thicker clouds, now mingling with the pale air. When most of the deck is cleared, you leave a thin dusting along the outer edges. It will blow away gradually. The important spaces are managed, balance is restored. You return to your bench and sit watching as the last flakes drift down and dissolve into the water. Winter at sea is not only wind and spray, it is also these quiet moments when the sky lowers itself gently onto your shelter. The snow has not defeated you. It has altered your tasks, added another layer of attention. You adjust as always, brush, clear, secure. And as the grey morning settles over ship and sea alike, you recognise that survival here depends as much on responding to subtle changes as on enduring obvious hardships. Even something as soft as falling snow demands respect. By afternoon, the snow has thinned to a memory along the edges of the deck. What replaces it is not gentler. The wind rises. You feel it first as a change in pressure against your cheek, then as a steady push against your cloak. The sea responds almost immediately. Small ripples sharpen into restless chop. The longship begins to move more assertively, bow lifting and dipping with greater force. Wind in winter carries a different personality. It is not merely air in motion. It is a blade drawn thin and invisible. It finds every seam in your clothing, every gap between glove and sleeve. You pull your cloak tighter and narrow your stance instinctively. A well-established truth of northern seafaring is that wind chill magnifies cold dramatically. Even moderate temperatures can become dangerous when strong gusts strip warmth from exposed skin. Viking sailors would have known this intimately, even if they lacked modern terminology. The sensation speaks clearly enough. The sail is raised, cautiously adjusted to catch what is useful without overstraining the mast. You step forward to help fingers stiff but determined. The wool canvas snaps once as it unfurls, then bellies outward, heavy and dark against the pale sky. Lines are secured, knots tightened. Immediately the ship gathers speed. Spray returns finer this time, but more frequent as the bow cuts through sharper waves. You taste salt again on your lips. There is a detail sometimes overlooked in quiet discussions of winter sailing. Strong winds and cold air can freeze moisture along the eyebrows and beard, creating tiny icicles that tug at skin. You feel the beginnings of it now. A faint stiffness along the edge of your scarf. You rub it away quickly before it thickens. Scholars continue to explore how Viking crews managed navigation and sail control in adverse weather without the complex rigging of later ships. The simplicity of the longship was both strength and limitation. Fewer lines meant fewer adjustments, yet it also required careful reading of wind and wave. As you watch the sail strain and then settle, you understand that skill lies not in abundance of tools, but in knowing how to use what you have. The steering oar demands greater attention now. Each gust nudges the hull sideways. The helmsman leans into it, muscles taut, adjusting angle by small degrees. You stand ready to assist if called, scanning the horizon for sudden shifts in watercolour that might signal submerged rock or floating ice. A modest but intriguing observation from maritime experiments suggests that Viking longships, because of their flexible hulls, handled choppy seas better than rigid vessels of similar size. The overlapping planks allowed the structure to bend slightly, rather than resist every motion. You feel that resilience beneath your boots. The deck moves, but it does not crack. The cold intensifies with the wind. Your eyes water slightly, tears threatened by the force of air. You blink hard and focus ahead. Movement is constant now, no one lies down, no one attempts to rest. Survival in this moment demands upright attention. There has long been debate among historians regarding the limits of Viking seamanship in extreme winter storms. Some argue that voyages were carefully planned to avoid the worst seasonal tempests. Others point to evidence of remarkable endurance, suggesting that necessity sometimes forced sailors into dangerous conditions. As the longship pitches and spray streaks across the deck, you sense how thin the margin can be. You adjust your footing again, knees bent to absorb the motion. A line slips slightly and you lunge forward to secure it, fingers burning as they grip the coarse rope. The wind howls briefly through the rigging, then steadies into a powerful rush. A curious anecdote from a medieval chronicle mentions sailors chewing on small pieces of dried meat during intense wind to keep jaws working and minds alert. The repetitive motion it claimed helped focus attention amid chaos. Whether this practice was widespread or anecdotal remains uncertain, yet you understand the instinct. Any small act that anchors the mind can matter when element pressad. Gradually, after what feels longer than it likely is, the gusts begin to ease. The sail slackens slightly. The sea, though still restless, loses its sharpest edge. You exhale slowly, aware that your shoulders have been clenched tight. The cold lingers even after the wind softens. Your cheeks sting where air struck hardest. You rub them gently, encouraging warmth back into the skin. Around you, others perform similar rituals, flexing fingers, adjusting scarves. The ship continues forward, steadier now. The episode was not catastrophic. It did not capsize you or tear sail from mast. Yet it reminds you how quickly conditions can shift in winter waters. You glance at the horizon once more, scanning for the next sign of change. The sky remains low and grey, but no immediate threat looms. The longship rides on resilient and responsive. In the quiet that follows, you recognise that survival here is dynamic. It is not merely enduring cold nights on still water. It is responding to wind that bites and shoves, to spray that freezes mid-air, to sails that strain and demand careful hands. You lower yourself briefly onto the bench once the immediate tasks subside, though you remain ready to rise again. The deck beneath you feels colder after the wind, but also reassuringly solid. The storm did not claim you. It tested the seams of your clothing and the strength of your grip. It reminded you that winter at sea is never static. And as the ship presses onward beneath a sky that seems carved from stone, you settle back into vigilance, aware that every gust is both adversary and teacher. The wind eases into a steady breath rather than a shove, and with that calmer rhythm comes an unexpected sound from near the bow, a low, uneasy bleat. You turn your head and see the source. Tucked carefully near the forward section of the ship, secured with rope and patience, stands a small goat. Its coat is thick, mottled brown and white, and its dark eyes blink at the shifting light. You had almost forgotten it in the intensity of wind and spray. It might surprise you, but livestock sometimes travelled aboard Norse ships, particularly on voyages intended for settlement rather than swift raids. A commonly accepted historical reality is that when families relocated to places like Iceland or Greenland, they brought animals with them to establish farms. Sheep, goats, even small cattle could be transported in limited numbers. On shorter journeys, animals might also serve as fresh provisions. You step closer, boots careful on the damp planks. The goat shifts its weight nervously as the ship rolls gently. Its presence adds a new layer to your understanding of winter survival. Animals generate heat, yes, but they also require care space and food. There is a practical advantage to their presence. A living animal radiates warmth. In a confined area of the ship, that warmth contributes subtly to the shared environment. You place your hand briefly against the goat's flank and feel the steady heat beneath its thick fur. It is tangible, reassuring. Yet there are complications. Animals produce waste, and in freezing conditions, that waste must be managed to prevent slippery hazards or unpleasant accumulation. Someone has spread a layer of straw beneath the goat's hooves, absorbing moisture and providing insulation against the cold deck. The straw itself becomes a modest source of warmth, trapping air within its dry stems. Some historians have questioned how frequently animals accompanied winter voyages specifically. While settlement expeditions clearly involved livestock, shorter trading or exploratory journeys may have limited such cargo to preserve space and stability. The balance between necessity and practicality would have been delicate. As you observe the goat adjusting to the movement of the sea, you sense how carefully such decisions must have been weighed. A small and rather charming detail found in later Icelandic accounts describes sailors speaking softly to animals during rough weather, as if reassuring them would steady both creature and crew. Whether this reflects common practice or literary embellishment is uncertain, yet you notice how one of the men strokes the goat's neck absent-mindedly while checking its tether. The animal's breath puffs visibly in the cold air, mirroring your own. In a strange way, its presence makes the deck feel less stark. Life aboard ship is not solely human endurance. It is shared among species, each adapting as best it can. There is ongoing academic discussion about how Norse settlers managed the transport of larger livestock across vast distances, especially to Greenland. Some scholars argue that the success of those colonies depended heavily on the careful movement of breeding animals. Others emphasize the risks involved, noting that loss of livestock during harsh crossings could cripple a fledgling settlement. You imagine a winter voyage with not just one goat, but several animals shifting nervously in the hold. The goat bleats again, softer this time. You offer it a small handful of dried grass from a bundled supply. It chews slowly, jaw moving with patient rhythm. Its calm steadies you unexpectedly. You consider the dual nature of animals aboard ship. They are potential food, yet also companions in hardship. In freezing nights, their body heat contributes marginally to the overall warmth beneath the sail canopy. In calmer moments, their quiet presence breaks the monotony of wood and water. A curious anecdote from a Norse saga tells of a cat brought aboard a voyage to control rodents among stored provisions. The idea of a cat prowling the narrow benches of a longship feels almost intimate. Whether such stories reflect widespread practice or isolated incidents remains debated, but the practicality is clear. Preserving food in winter was paramount. You step back and glance along the length of the deck. The goat stands firm, now accustomed to the motion. The crew moves around it with familiarity, adjusting lines and checking ropes without fuss. Winter survival at sea extends beyond cloaks and fire. It includes the careful integration of animals into limited space, their warmth, their needs, their quiet resilience. As evening approaches, again the goat settles her legs tucked beneath its body. You notice how its presence slightly disrupts wind flow near the bow, creating a tiny pocket of stillness behind it. It is a small effect, almost negligible, yet in this environment even small differences matter. You return to your bench and draw your cloak tighter, aware of the animal's steady breathing nearby. The deck feels marginally less desolate with another heartbeat aboard. The Longship continues forward, carrying not only people and provisions, but living creatures whose survival intertwines with yours. In the deep cold of winter nights, that shared endurance feels quietly significant. You close your eyes briefly and listen to the layered sounds: wind, water, human breath, and the faint rhythmic chew of a goat finding comfort in the midst of winter at sea. The coastline fades into a thin, grey line behind you as the Longship presses into broader water. There are fewer sheltered coves here, fewer easy chances to beach and build a fire. The horizon stretches wide and indifferent in every direction as so a low arc beneath a pale winter sky. You feel the change immediately. Without the promise of frequent landfall, every decision carries more weight. The cold seems sharper when there is no nearby shore to retreat to. You pull your cloak tighter and glance toward the sail, gauging its tension against the wind. It's well supported by historical evidence that Viking trade routes extended far beyond sheltered fjords. Norse sailors travelled to the British Isles, across the North Sea, down European rivers, and eventually into the North Atlantic toward Iceland and Greenland. These journeys did not always wait for perfect weather. Trade demanded timing, opportunity required boldness and mass. Spray still reaches the deck, though less frequently than during sharp winds. What replaces immediate danger is a lingering awareness of distance. If something goes wrong, help is not waiting just beyond a headland. There has long been discussion among historians about whether winter crossings of open water were common or exceptional. Some scholars argue that experienced crews understood seasonal wind patterns well enough to plan departures, strategically minimizing exposure to the harshest conditions. Others suggest that economic pressure or political urgency sometimes forced voyages in less favorable months. As you scan the endless water, you sense that necessity likely guided many such choices. A curious detail from Norse sources indicates that traders often carried goods like walrus ivory furs and dried fish across long distances, even in colder seasons, driven by demand in foreign markets. The thought of valuable cargo stowed carefully below your feet adds another layer to this voyage. Survival is not only about staying warm, it is about protecting what you carry. You move toward the center of the deck and crouch, briefly checking that bundles remain secured. Even subtle shifts in distance can become dangerous if cargo slides during heavy swell. The ship must remain stable, evenly weighted against the sea. The cold persists, though it feels different from the biting wind of yesterday. It is steadier, more constant, like a background presence rather than an assault. You flex your fingers and feel the familiar ache that accompanies long exposure. Your body has grown used to it, adapting in small ways. Shivering comes less frequently now. Movements are more deliberate. Was limited. Some point to the use of was limited. Some point to the use of coastal hugging strategies whenever possible. Others highlight knowledge of currents, bird patterns, and even the subtle colour of water to infer proximity to land. While much remains debated, what is clear is that winter demanded heightened awareness. A small anecdote recorded in later medieval texts mentions sailors tasting seawater to detect subtle changes in salinity that might indicate nearby river mouths or land. Whether this was a widespread technique or a literary flourish remains uncertain, yet the idea underscores how attuned these crews were to their environment. You straighten and gaze forward again. The sky has taken on a faint golden hue near the horizon, though the sun itself remains hidden. Time feels elongated out here. Without visible landmarks, hours blend into one another, marked only by shifts in light and the routine of watches. The Longship rides smoothly for now, the sail draws steadily. Oars rest unused along the sides. The crew settles into a quieter rhythm, conserving energy for whatever the night might bring. You think about the choice to sail in winter at all. It is not recklessness, but calculation. The sea may be colder, yet it can also be less crowded. Surprise can favour those willing to endure discomfort. Trade networks may rely on timing that does not pause for frost. A modest but intriguing note from archaeological studies of Norse settlements suggests that some voyages may have been timed to align with winter markets in distant lands. Goods arriving when others hesitated could command higher value. Survival and profit intertwined in subtle ways. You shift your weight and sit along the bench once more, feeling the familiar curve of the hull against your back. The openness of the sea magnifies both vulnerability and resilience. There is nowhere to hide from cold wind or sudden squall, yet there is also clarity in this expanse. As dusk approaches, you prepare mentally for another night afloat rather than ashore. The sail canopy may be raised if conditions allow, watches will rotate, food will be rationed carefully. The goat near the bow shifts and settles again, its steady presence, a reminder that this voyage carries more than people and goods, it carries intention. You draw a slow breath, tasting salt and cold together. Winter travel across open water demands not just strength but composure. Each decision must be measured, each adjustment deliberate. The shoreline is gone now, replaced by horizon on all sides. Yet the longship continues narrow and determined, slicing through the chill. And as evening gathers once more, you recognize that survival here is not tied to proximity to land. It rests in preparation discipline, and the quiet courage to move forward even when warmth lies far behind you. The sea at night carries stories. You lie along the bench with your cloak pulled close, listening to the hush of water sliding past the hull. Above you, the sky is unusually clear, scattered with stars that seem almost close enough to touch. In this quiet stretch between wind and snowfall, your mind drifts toward the tales told in warmer halls, sagas of endurance and icy valor. The popular image of Viking sailors often leans toward the dramatic. Men laughing in blizzards, warriors unfazed by frost. Yet the historical record, when examined carefully, paints a more nuanced picture. Norse sagas certainly celebrate bravery and hardship, but they also reveal vulnerability. People grew cold, they suffered, they adapted. It is firmly grounded in historical scholarship that many of the Icelandic sagas were written down centuries after the events they describe, blending oral tradition with literary embellishment. This means that while they offer valuable insight into cultural values, they cannot always be taken as literal accounts of winter survival at sea. You consider this as you shift slightly to ease the pressure on your hip. Reality rarely glows as brightly as legend. There has long been debate among historians about how much of the Viking Age narrative has been romanticised in modern times. Some scholars argue that 19th century nationalism amplified the image of stoic seafarers conquering frozen oceans. Others maintain that the core achievements remain impressive, even without embellishment. As you lie here feeling the steady cold seep through layers of wool, you sense the truth somewhere between myth and muscle. A curious detail found in certain saga passages describes sailors invoking specific verses or charms during harsh weather, murmuring lines believed to steady the sea or strengthen resolve. Whether these were literal incantations or narrative devices remains uncertain, yet they reflect an awareness that endurance is as much mental as physical. You glance toward the bow where the carved figurehead looms against the stars. In the dim light it feels almost animate. The sagas speak of ships as companions, sometimes even as characters in their own right. The vessel is not merely wooden rivets, it is a bearer of fate. Scholars continue to explore how belief systems influence seafaring practices. Did sailors truly believe their dragon prows warded off spirits, or were these carvings primarily symbolic expressions of identity and power? The answer likely varied from crew to crew. Faith and practicality often coexist comfortably. The cold tonight feels steady rather than savage. You adjust your cloak and listen to the breathing around you. The goat near the bow has gone quiet, perhaps asleep. The sea's rhythm is gentle, almost soothing. In saga literature, winter voyages sometimes appear as trials sent by destiny, moments where heroes prove their worth against elemental forces. Yet when you focus on your own sensations, there is nothing grand about it. Your toes are cold, your back aches slightly from the bench. You are not battling a mythic storm. You are managing discomfort hour by hour. A lesser-known observation from literary analysis points out that saga authors often emphasize communal endurance over individual heroics. Crews survive together. Settlements persist through cooperation. This collective resilience aligns more closely with what you experience now than the image of solitary conquest. You draw your knees closer and feel the warmth shared between bodies beneath overlapping cloaks. No one here is invincible. Everyone depends on preparation and proximity. There is ongoing academic conversation about the reliability of saga descriptions when it comes to practical details such as ship construction and winter conditions. Some researchers argue that while narrative flourishes abound, technical aspects often reflect genuine maritime knowledge. Others caution that literary symbolism may distort everyday realities. As you listen to the creak of planks beneath you, you suspect that lived experience informed at least some of those ancient lines. A small anecdote preserved in a Greenlandic tale describes sailors laughing quietly at the exaggerations told about them back home, amused at being portrayed as larger than life. Whether true or not, the idea feels fitting. Survival rarely looks heroic from the inside. The stars shimmer above sharp and steady. You trace a familiar constellation and think about how those same patterns guided countless voyages. Myth and navigation intertwine. Stories offer meaning. Stars offer direction. You close your eyes briefly and let the murmur of the sea carry you. The sagas may remember the boldness of winter crossings, but they do not linger on every shiver or sore muscle. They condense nights like this into a line or two. Yet here in this moment the details matter. The scratch of wool against your chin, the faint scent of tar, the shared warmth beneath a sky so clear it feels almost brittle. Winter survival on a longship is neither pure legend nor simple hardship. It is a tapestry woven from wood-wool belief and breath. And as the night deepens and the stars hold their silent vigil, you find comfort not in dramatic heroism, but in the steady continuity of experience. Myth may amplify the memory of nights like this, but reality sustains you through them, one careful hour at a time. Morning arrives slowly filtered through a thin veil of cloud that turns the world a muted silver. You wake to the soft rustle of movement near the stern and a lighter voice than usual speaking in hushed tones. When you sit up and blink the stiffness from your eyes, you notice him clearly for the first time. A boy. He cannot be more than 12 or 13 winters old. His cloak is smaller, his boots slightly oversized as if passed down. He grips a coil of rope with determined focus, trying to mimic the practiced motions of the older sailors. His breath fogs in quick bursts and he glances around as if hoping no one notices his uncertainty. It is a well-supported historical understanding that young people often went to sea in the Viking Age, whether as apprentices, relatives of crew members, or part of settlement expeditions. Maritime skills were not reserved for the fully grown. They were learned early, passed from hand to hand like tools. Childhood in this world blended quickly into responsibility. You watch as the boy tugs at the rope, his fingers red from cold. He works methodically, though the line resists his efforts. One of the older men steps in quietly, adjusts the angle of the coil, and shows him how to loop it more efficiently. There is no scolding, just instruction. The cold does not discriminate by age. The boy's cheeks are flushed, his nose slightly raw from wind. Yet he stands steady, jaw set in quiet resolve. You feel a flicker of admiration mixed with concern. There has been considerable discussion among historians about the age at which Norse youths began participating in voyages. Some scholars suggest that sons of sailors would have been introduced gradually to maritime life, starting with coastal trips before braving open water. Others argue that necessity, especially in smaller communities, may have drawn younger members into harsher conditions more quickly. The evidence is fragmentary, leaving room for interpretation. A curious detail from certain saga passages hints at boys serving as messengers or lookouts during calmer stretches of travel roles that allowed them to learn while contributing meaningfully. Whether these accounts reflect common practice or narrative embellishment is uncertain. Yet watching the boy now, you can imagine how such roles might emerge naturally. He glances toward the horizon, perhaps trying to gauge distance or simply to steady his nerves. You remember your own first night on this open deck, the way the cold seemed personal and invasive. For him, it must feel even larger. You shift slightly to make room as he moves past you, carrying a small wooden bucket to clear residual water from the deck. His steps are careful, mimicking the balance of those around him. The longship rocks gently and he adjusts instinctively. Researchers examining Norse social structures often emphasize that skill acquisition was embedded in daily life, rather than confined to formal instruction. Knowledge of sailing, knot tying, and weather reading would have been absorbed through observation and repetition. You see that process unfolding now in real time. The boy kneels near the gunwale and pushes slushy remnants of snow overboard. His movements are slower than those of the seasoned crew, but he persists. One of the men murmurs a quiet word of approval. The boy's shoulders straighten slightly. There is an ongoing scholarly conversation about how exposure to hardship shaped identity in Viking societies. Some argue that early immersion in demanding environments fostered resilience and communal bonds. Others caution against romanticizing such experiences, noting the physical and emotional toll they likely carried. As you watch the boy's breath rise in small, determined clouds, you feel both perspectives intertwine. A small anecdote from a later Icelandic source recounts a young sailor earning his first cloak brooch after surviving a winter voyage, a symbolic acknowledgement of maturity. Whether such rites were widespread or localized traditions remains unclear, but the idea of recognition resonates. Endurance here is not abstract. It marks you. The boy pauses and rubs his hands together, trying to restore warmth. You lean slightly closer, letting your cloak overlap his for a moment. He glances at you surprised, then nods faintly in thanks. The goat at the bow bleats softly, drawing his attention. He moves toward it with cautious curiosity, offering a small handful of feed, The animal's steady presence seems to comfort him as much as it does you. The sky brightens incrementally, revealing the faint outline of distant land far off the starboard side. A murmur passes through the crew as someone points it out. The boy's eyes widen, briefly wonder replacing tension. Survival in winter at sea is not only about the seasoned and the strong, it includes those still learning, still growing into their roles. The cold shapes them as surely as it shapes the rest of you. You settle back against the hull and observe, as the boy resumes his tasks, movements more confident now. The deck remains cold, the wind persistent, but something about his presence softens the atmosphere. Endurance is not a solitary trait. It is inherited, practiced, refined across generations. And as the longship glides forward under a pale winter sky, you recognize that survival is being taught quietly here between rope coils and buckets of slush beneath the same unforgiving air. The boy may shiver tonight as you do, he may lie awake longer than he admits, but he is here learning the rhythm of cold and wood and water. And in that quieter apprenticeship, winter at sea becomes not just a trial, but a teacher. Later that afternoon, as the light thins into a pale wash across the water, you notice another presence you had only half registered before. Near the stern, seated with steady composure, is a woman. Tentative uncertainty of the boy, nor with tentative uncertainty of the boy, nor with the exaggerated swagger sometimes imagined in tales of warriors. She works quietly adjusting a bundle of provisions, checking knots with practiced fingers. It's a well-supported historical conclusion that women did participate in certain voyages, particularly those connected to settlement. Archaeological findings in places like Iceland and Greenland reveal the presence of women in early Norse communities, indicating that entire families sometimes travelled across cold seas. While not every longship carried women, it's inaccurate to imagine these journeys as exclusively male. You watch as she rises and steps carefully across the deck, balancing with the subtle ease of someone accustomed to movement at sea. The wind presses her cloak against her legs, outlining a silhouette as steady as any man aboard. We're predominantly male trading, and settlement voyages likely included women more frequently. Others suggest that literary sources may have underrepresented their presence, focusing instead on dramatic male exploits. The evidence invites reflection rather than certainty. She pauses beside this boy and offers a quiet correction as he fumbles with a knot. Her tone is firm but gentle. The boy nods and adjusts his grip. Instruction flows naturally without ceremony. A fascinating detail from certain burial sites, such as the Oseberg ship burial, reveals that high-status women were interred with ships and rich grave goods, suggesting significant social influence. While that burial does not confirm routine seafaring, it complicates simplistic narratives about gender roles in Norse society. The sea, like the land, was not shaped by one type of presence alone. You feel the cold settle deeper as evening approaches. The woman draws her cloak closer and scans the horizon briefly before returning to her task. Her expression is focused, practical. There has been ongoing debate about the existence of so-called shield maidens, women who may have taken up arms alongside men. Some scholars argue that certain saga accounts and skeletal analyses hint at such roles. Others caution against reading literary legend as direct evidence. Whatever the truth in martial context, it is clear that women contributed meaningfully to voyages that established new settlements. The goat shifts near the bow and she moves to check its tether, ensuring it remains secure. Her hands are deft movements, economical. You notice how naturally she navigates the narrow space of the deck. Winter does not soften for anyone. The wind brushes her face as sharply as it does yours, yet she remains composed, adjusting layers of wool with practiced efficiency. A small anecdote preserved in later Scandinavian folklore tells of women aboard ships overseeing the preservation of food during long journeys, ensuring that dried fish and meat were rationed carefully to last through harsh conditions. Whether this was universally true is uncertain, but the logic aligns with broader domestic responsibilities adapted to maritime settings. You shift slightly to make space as she passes, and she offers a brief nod in acknowledgement. There is no sense of novelty in her presence, only shared endurance. The sky darkens further, and preparations for night begin once more. The sail may be lowered if wind allows. Watches will be assigned. Cloaks will be drawn close. Scholars continue to explore how gender-shaped experiences of travel and settlement in the Viking Age, recognizing that historical records often preserve only fragments of reality. As you observe her steady movements against the backdrop of winter sea, you sense how incomplete any single narrative must be. She settles along a bench not far from you, tucking her cloak beneath her knees and adjusting the fabric to block drafts. The boy sits nearby, perhaps reassured by her presence. The deck feels slightly different now, not warmer exactly, but more balanced. Survival here is not bound to one identity. It is a collective effort shaped by skill and preparation rather than assumption. The wind hums softly through the rigging. The stars begin to appear faint at first, then clearer. You draw your own cloak tighter and lean back against the curve of the hull. The woman closes her eyes briefly, conserving energy before her next task. Winter at sea does not distinguish by age or gender. It demands attention from all who stand upon the deck. And as the longship moves steadily through cold water, you recognize that resilience here is shared, taught, and embodied in many forms. The night deepens, and you settle once more into the rhythm of breath and wood and wind, aware that every presence aboard contributes to the fragile shelter you create together against the freezing dark. Sometime in the deep stretch of night, when the stars seem suspended in a brittle stillness above you, a sound interrupts the quiet rhythm of breath and water. A cough, not the casual clearing of a throat, but a persistent rasp that scrapes at the silence. You open your eyes and turn your head slightly. The sound comes again, followed by a shallow inhale that does not quite settle. Illness at sea carries a different weight than discomfort. Cold can be endured, wind can be managed, but sickness introduces uncertainty. It is well established that in the Viking Age people had no knowledge of microbes or modern medicine. They understood symptom, they recognized patterns, but their remedies relied on herbs, rest, and experience rather than antibiotics or antiseptics. You push yourself upright and glance toward the source of the coughing. He is one of the older men, wrapped tightly in his cloak, yet visibly shivering despite the layers. His face glistens faintly in the starlight. Fever, perhaps. The cold has a way of weakening the body's defences. Prolonged exposure, damp clothing, fragmented sleep, all of it accumulates. Maritime historians often note that while dramatic shipwrecks dominate narratives, more subtle threats, such as illness, likely pose frequent challenges during extended voyages. The woman you noticed earlier shifts closer to the coughing man, pressing a hand gently to his forehead. Even in dim light you can see the tension in her brow. She reaches into a small pouch at her side and withdraws a bundle of dried leaves. There has been ongoing scholarly exploration of Norse herbal knowledge. Archaeological findings and later texts suggest familiarity with plants like yarrow and angelica, which were used for various ailments. Whether such remedies were carried routinely aboard ships remains uncertain, yet it seems plausible that experienced travellers would have brought basic treatments. A curious detail preserved in some saga literature describes sailors chewing certain bitter roots to ward off sickness during long voyages. While modern science may question their effectiveness, the practice reflects an active approach to managing health in harsh conditions. The coughing man is given a small amount of warm liquid from a carefully guarded pot. It may be infused with herbs or simply heated water. Either way, warmth itself is therapeutic. He sips slowly, shoulders hunched. You feel a ripple of unease move through the group. Illness spreads more easily in close quarters. Cloaks overlap, breath mingles, there is little room for isolation on a narrow bench. Historians continue to examine how communities at sea responded to sickness without the option of stepping ashore immediately. Some suggest that voyages may have been shortened if a key member fell severely ill. Others argue that necessity often forced crews to press on despite risk. The record does not provide simple answers. You adjust your own position, slightly aware of the proximity of bodies. Fear is not dramatic here. It is quiet and practical. You consider whether the man became chilled after clearing snow, whether damp wool remained too long against his skin. The goat near the bow shifts restlessly, sensing perhaps the change in tone. Its soft movement punctuates the man's coughing. The woman wraps an additional layer around his shoulders, tucking fabric carefully to trap heat. The boy watches with wide eyes, absorbing yet another lesson about winter at sea. A small anecdote from a later Scandinavian chronicle recounts sailors chanting softly around a sick companion, not as ritual magic but as comfort. Human voices can steady a faltering spirit. Whether such acts were common is uncertain, but you sense the instinct to gather close rather than retreat. You pull your cloak tighter and lie back down, though sleep does not come easily. The cough returns intermittently, a reminder that survival here depends not only on wood and wool but on the resilience of fragile bodies. The sea continues its indifferent rhythm beneath you, the stars remain clear and cold above. By morning the man's fever has eased slightly, though his voice remains rough. He sits propped against the hull, sipping carefully from a wooden cup. The crisis has not deepened, but it has not vanished either. You realise how thin the margin is. A simple illness in such conditions can escalate quickly. Without rest and warmth, the body struggles. Researchers studying Viking Age settlements note that community care was essential in environments where professional medical knowledge was limited. Families and crews relied on shared wisdom passed down through generations, You witness that collective care here in the careful adjustments of cloak and cup. Winter survival on a longship is not only about resisting the cold, it is about tending to one another when the cold finds its way inside. As the ship glides forward beneath a pale morning sky, you carry both relief and vigilance. The cough may fade, or it may linger. Sky clears again, as if illness itself has thinned the clouds. You sit upright on your bench, cloak drawn close, and tilt your head back. Above you stretches a vault of stars so sharp they seem carved into ice. Navigation in winter relies less on visible coastlines and more on memory and sky. A firmly grounded historical understanding is that Viking sailors possessed sophisticated knowledge of celestial navigation, even if they left no written manuals behind. They observed the sun's arc, the position of stars, and the behaviour of birds and currents. Their expertise was experiential rather than theoretical. You trace the familiar line of constellations with your eyes. The North Star holds steady, small but unwavering. It offers orientation when landmarks vanish into darkness. The helmsman glances upward periodically, aligning his sense of direction with that fixed point. There has been extensive academic discussion about the so-called sunstone mentioned in certain medieval texts, a crystal believed to help locate the sun's position, even on overcast days. Some researchers argue that certain types of ice and spar could polarize light in ways that reveal the sun's hidden location. Others question whether this device was commonly used or whether references to it have been misinterpreted. The debate continues, balanced between experiment and speculation. You imagine holding such a crystal to the sky, turning it slowly until a faint glow intensifies. Whether myth or method, the idea reflects a culture attentive to subtle cues in nature. A lesser-known but intriguing detail comes from Norse sagas that mention the use of ravens released from ships to locate nearby land. If the bird returned, no shore was near. If it flew off in a particular direction and did not come back, land likely lay that way. While such stories may blend fact and flourish, they illustrate a practical creativity shaped by necessity. You glance toward the horizon, though at this hour it is indistinguishable from sea. Darkness flattens the world into two shades. The longship moves steadily, sail trimmed carefully to match the wind's angle. Scholars continue to explore how Viking navigators balance celestial observation with environmental awareness. Tidal currents, the colour of water, even the scent of air could signal proximity to land. Some researchers suggest that experienced sailors memorized wave patterns unique to certain coastlines. Others caution that such claims may overestimate precision. As you sit beneath the stars, you recognize that knowledge here is cumulative, layered through years of practice. The cold feels sharper tonight, without snowfall to soften sound. Your breath rises in pale ribbons. You tuck your hands into your sleeves and lean slightly against the hull for support as you study the sky. The boy sits nearby, eyes lifted upward as well. You hear him whisper the names of a few constellations under his breath, testing memory. The woman corrects him gently, pointing to a cluster he misidentified. Learning continues even here beneath freezing stars. A modest but fascinating observation from experimental voyages suggests that night sailing in winter could sometimes be calmer than daytime travel as winds dropped after sunset. Whether this was consistent or region-specific remains debated, yet the relative stillness tonight supports the idea. You feel the ship glide more smoothly now, cutting through dark water with minimal resistance. The stars seem brighter for the absence of cloud. They create an illusion of warmth simply by their steady presence. There has long been discussion among historians about how Norse navigators managed prolonged darkness during the deep winter months when daylight dwindled to only a few hours. Some suggest that voyages were timed to avoid the darkest weeks. Others argue that necessity sometimes required travel even then. The archaeological record leaves room for interpretation. You adjust your cloak once more and shift your gaze from star to star. The act of looking upwards steadies your thoughts. Direction replaces anxiety. A small anecdote preserved in later medieval writing describes sailors telling stories of stars as ancestors watching over them. Whether literal belief or poetic metaphor, the sentiment speaks to a need for reassurance in vast darkness. The sea below reflects faint points of light where waves ripple gently. It is as if you float between two skies, one above and one fractured beneath. You lower your gaze briefly to check the sail's tension, then look upward again. Navigation here is not about instruments or maps spread across tables. It is about memory and observation passed from elder to youth without written record. The helmsman adjusts the steering oar slightly, guided by the North Star's fixed glow. The longship responds with subtle grace. Winter nights at sea are not solely trials of endurance. They are also moments of orientation when sky becomes compass and stars become silent companions. As the hours pass and your eyes grow heavy, You take comfort in the knowledge that even in darkness direction remains possible. Above you, ancient patterns hold their place. By mid-morning, the sky has dulled again and the longship continues forward, guided not by walls or lanterns, but by the steady light of distant stars. By mid-morning, the sky has dulled again and the sea carries a low metallic sheen. You notice it first in the rigging. A faint stiffness, a subtle change in the way the ropes respond when pulled. Ice, not the dramatic slabs that block entire fjords, but a thin, creeping glaze forming along the lines and at the base of the mast. It begins almost invisibly moisture freezing in the night air and binding fibres together. You run your fingers along a rope and feel the brittle resistance beneath the hemp. It is a well-documented reality of cold weather sailing that ice accumulation on rigging can compromise both flexibility and safety. Frozen lines resist adjustment. Knots become stubborn. In extreme cases, added weight aloft can destabilize a vessel. On a longship where simplicity governs the sail system, even minor stiffness can matter. You flex your hands and begin working the rope, carefully bending and loosening it before the ice thickens. Another crew member joins you, tapping gently along the length with the wooden handle of a tool to break fragile crusts. There has been thoughtful debate among maritime historians about how frequently Norse sailors encountered serious icing conditions during winter voyages. Some scholars argue that coastal routes and relatively shorter journeys limited exposure to extreme buildup. Others note that in North Atlantic crossings, freezing spray could accumulate rapidly under certain conditions. The evidence comes from a blend of saga descriptions and environmental reconstruction. You move toward the mast and inspect the base where small droplets have solidified into translucent beads. You chip them away cautiously. The sound is delicate, almost like glass cracking softly. A lesser-known but intriguing detail from experimental archaeology suggests that constant motion of ropes can prevent heavier ice formation. Lines that remain in use flexed and adjusted resist freezing more effectively than those left untouched. You understand now why even in calmer moments sailors keep their hands active. The boy appears at your side, eyes wide as he studies the frost creeping along the rigging. You show him how to twist the rope, gently warming it through friction before forcing any knot to move. He nods, concentrating. The wind freshens slightly, carrying new moisture across the deck. You glance upward to check the sail. Its lower edge shows a thin rim of white, though the wool beneath remains pliable. The treated fabric resists immediate stiffening, a testament to its preparation. Scholars continue to examine the materials used in Viking Age rope making, noting the reliance on plant fibres such as hemp and sometimes animal hair. The durability of these materials in cold conditions likely influenced maintenance practices at sea. While we lack detailed written manuals, the physical evidence from surviving fragments reveals a keen understanding of resilience. You shift your attention to the steering oar. Its surface feels colder than before, faint frost tracing along the grain. The helmsman rubs it briskly with a scrap of wool to maintain grip. A curious anecdote preserved in later seafaring lore speaks of sailors breathing warm air onto frozen knots before attempting to untie them using their own breath as a tool. You try it now on a smaller loop, exhaling steadily before loosening it with care. The ice softens just enough to yield. The deck beneath you remains relatively clear though. Small patches of frozen spray cling near the gunwale. You scrape them away methodically, preventing slick spots from forming. There has been ongoing scholarly discussion about whether Viking ships were ever equipped with specialized tools for de-icing. Some researchers argue that everyday implements such as axes and wooden mallets likely served this purpose. Others caution against assuming too much specialization in vessels designed for speed and versatility. As you tap gently along a rope with the back of a knife handle, you suspect that ingenuity mattered more than specialized equipment. The goat near the bow shifts uneasily as frost sparkles along its tether. You brush the line free carefully, ensuring it remains flexible. The sky remains a flat grey, offering no warmth to counter the creeping chill. Yet your steady movement generates its own heat, friction, motion, attention. This is not dramatic in its early stages. It is subtle, almost beautiful, but left unchecked it binds and burdens. You recognize the lesson in that as you continue your work. Gradually the lines regain their suppleness. The sail edges are cleared. The mast base stands free of crystalline beads. The longship feels lighter again, responsive. You step back and flex your aching fingers, feeling the sting as circulation returns. Around you, the crew performs similar checks, each person scanning for overlooked patches. Winter at sea is a conversation between elements and vigilance. Ice speaks softly at first, whispering along rope and wood. It is your task to answer before it raises its voice. As the ship glides forward beneath the dull sky, you rest briefly against the hull, satisfied that for now flexibility has been restored. The cold persists. It always does, but the rigging remains alive and your hands bending rather than breaking. And in that careful maintenance you find another quiet layer of survival woven into the frozen day. The hours after sunset stretch longer than you expect. There is no storm tonight, no snowfall, no sudden crisis demanding urgent movement. The sea rolls gently beneath you, steady and almost indifferent. Yet something else presses in. Silence. You lie along the bench, cloak drawn high, and stare at the dim outline of the sail furled against the mast. The stars are obscured by a thin veil of cloud. The horizon dissolves into darkness. Without clear landmarks, without bright constellations to trace the world, feels smaller and larger at once. It's widely recognised by historians studying seafaring communities that long stretches of monotony could test morale as surely as violent weather. Survival is not only physical, it is mental. Winter nights at sea, especially during extended voyages, demanded patience as much as strength. You shift slightly, listening to the faint breathing around you. No one speaks. The boy has finally fallen into a shallow sleep. The woman rests with her hands folded beneath her chin. The older man, who coughed earlier, breathes more evenly now, though a faint rasp lingers. In this quiet, your thoughts grow louder. How many nights remain before land appears? How many more dawns will break over water rather than shore? You catch yourself spiraling into speculation and force your attention back to immediate sensation. The feel of wool against your cheek, the steady creak of planks, the subtle lift and fall of the hull. Scholars examining Viking Age culture often emphasize the importance of storytelling as a means of maintaining cohesion and morale. In long winters, ashore sagas were recited by firelight. At sea, even brief tales shared in low voices could relieve tension. Tonight, however, fatigue outweighs conversation. There has been thoughtful discussion about the psychological resilience required for voyages into unknown or sparsely charted waters. Some historians suggest that belief systems, whether rooted in Norse mythology or simple trust in one another, provided mental anchoring. Others argue that practical focus on tasks and routines was the primary stabilizer. As you lie here, you sense that both likely played a role. A modest but intriguing detail from experimental reconstructions of longship voyages notes that crew members often developed unspoken rituals during extended travel. Small habits repeated nightly. The same position on a bench, the same order of checking lines before sleep. These rituals created predictability in an unpredictable environment. You notice your own pattern now. Tug cloak, flex toes, listen for unusual creaks, breathe slowly. The repetition steadies you. The darkness feels thicker tonight without clear stars. You imagine the vast expanse of water stretching beyond sight. It could easily invite unease, yet the longship continues forward with steady purpose, guided by hands that trust experience. Historians continue to explore how Norse crews interpreted the unknown. Were distant horizons sources of fear or opportunity? Likely both. Human response to uncertainty rarely fits into a single emotion. A small anecdote preserved in later medieval commentary describes sailors carving tiny marks into wooden objects to count days at sea, creating a tangible record of progress. Whether this practice was widespread is uncertain, but the impulse resonates. Time measured becomes time endured. You consider marking the inside of your cloak with a stitch for each night survived, then you smile faintly at the thought. Survival here is not tallied in dramatic milestones. It is accumulated quietly. The goat shifts and lets out a soft sigh, breaking the stillness. The sound reminds you that life continues in simple ways, even amid long stretches of dark. The wind hums gently through the rigging, not strong enough to alarm, not calm enough to ignore, just present. You close your eyes briefly and focus on breath. Inhale, exhale. The rhythm of the sea beneath you mirrors that pattern. Up, down, up, down. Mental endurance grows from such small alignments. You cannot control the horizon, you cannot command the weather, but you can align your breath with the ship's motion and let that steadiness anchor you. Of collective effort toward trade settlement or return home, likely strengthened resolve. As you listen to the breathing around you, you feel that shared purpose as a subtle current beneath the cold. The night does not lighten quickly, it lingers expansive and quiet. Yet you remain thoughts, slowing heartbeats steadying. Winter at sea tests more than muscle and wool. It tests patience. It asks whether you can sit within silence without unraveling. Gradually your mind settles. The darkness becomes less threatening, more like a heavy blanket draped across the world. The Longship glides onward through unseen water. The crew rests in fragments, and you lie there eyes closed now, letting the slow cadence of hull and breath carry you through another quiet, endless night. By late afternoon, the horizon sharpens and a faint smudge appears ahead. Land again, though not the familiar curve of a sheltered fjord. This coastline looks harsher, lower edged with dark rock that meets the sea without much ceremony. As the Longship draws closer, you study the shape of the shore. Sparse trees cling to wind-exposed ridges. Patches of snow linger in hollows. It feels less forgiving than the wooded coves you sheltered in before. You find yourself wondering how other seafaring peoples endure winters like this. The Norse are not the only ones who face cold water and relentless wind. Across the North Sea and beyond, different cultures have carved out their own solutions. It is well established that during the early medieval period, various maritime societies operated in northern waters, including the Anglo-Saxons, the Frisians, and later the peoples of the Baltic. Each developed vessels suited to their environment. Some favoured broader hulls for cargo stability. Others relied more heavily on river navigation than open ocean travel. You picture a Saxon trader hugging the English coast in winter, his ship deeper and less flexible than your Longship. He might carry heavier cargo but sacrifice the ability to beach easily. Would his crew sleep beneath a decked structure, or face the wind as you do? Featured higher sides and more enclosed spaces offering greater protection from spray. Some historians argue that such designs represented a gradual shift toward prioritizing shelter and cargo over speed. Others caution against oversimplifying, noting that each ship type served distinct purposes. You glance at your own ship's low profile, its sleek symmetry. It slices efficiently through water but offers minimal permanent cover. The trade-off is clear. A curious detail from maritime archaeology reveals that certain Baltic ships incorporated partial decking earlier than some Norse longships, possibly providing modest shelter for goods and crew. Whether these differences significantly altered winter survival remains debated, yet they suggest a spectrum of approaches rather than a single model. As the Longship edges nearer the rocky coast, you reflect on how design shapes endurance. Your vessel allows rapid landing, the ability to drag onto shore and build a fire. Another culture's ship might remain afloat longer, relying on enclosed space instead of beaching. Scholars continue to discuss whether Norse seamanship was uniquely advanced or simply one of several effective maritime traditions. Some emphasize the remarkable reach of Viking voyages across the Atlantic. Others highlight the strengths of Mediterranean ships in their own environments. Context matters. The wind carries the faint scent of land, now earthy and sharp. You inhale deeply, grateful for the shift. The boy stands beside you, peering ahead with curiosity. The woman adjusts a bundle of provisions, preparing in case a landing becomes possible. Even if the shore is rugged, a brief respite on solid ground may be worth the effort. You think about sailors from warmer regions venturing north. How would a Mediterranean crew accustomed to milder winters cope with this cold? Would their clothing suffice? Would their hull designs handle icy spray as well? There has been thoughtful academic exploration of cultural exchange between Norse and other European seafarers. Trade routes connected diverse communities, sharing not only goods but techniques. It is possible that winter survival strategies evolved through observation and adaptation rather than isolation. A small anecdote from a later English chronicle describes local fishermen marvelling at the resilience of Norse crews who arrived during colder months, remarking on their layered wool garments and calm demeanour. Whether exaggerated or sincere, such impressions reveal mutual awareness. The Longship slows as you approach the uneven shoreline. Oars dip cautiously to control the angle of approach. The rocky shallows demand precision. You feel a quiet pride in the vessel beneath you. Its design may not enclose you fully, but it grants flexibility. It allows you to seek land when necessary, to respond quickly when conditions shift. Comparisons with other maritime cultures do not diminish your experience. They enrich it. They remind you that winter survival is not a single story told by one people. It is a shared human challenge met with varied ingenuity. As the keel scrapes lightly against a narrow strip of sand between rocks, you prepare to push once more. The ground may be uneven, the shelter imperfect, but solid earth offers relief no hull can replicate. You step into the shallows, boots splashing, and lean against the hull with others. The Longship slides forward, resting awkwardly but securely against the rugged shore. The wind continues to blow, indifferent to culture or craft, yet you stand upon land again, comparing quietly in your mind the many ways humans have faced this same cold sea. And as you gather driftwood among rocks and watch the crew secure the vessel, you recognize that survival here is both uniquely Norse and universally human. The rocky shore offers little comfort, yet it offers perspective. While others gather driftwood and check the hull for scrapes, you run your hand along the overlapping planks, tracing the iron rivets that hold them fast. Each rivet head is slightly domed, darkened by tar and time. You imagine the hands that hammered them into place, sealing wood to wood with deliberate precision. Archaeological excavations over the past century have uncovered remarkably preserved Viking ships in burial mounds, most famously at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway. These discoveries have provided invaluable insight into construction methods, materials, and craftsmanship. The ships were not merely symbolic objects, they were practical masterpieces adapted to northern waters. You glance at the curve of the keel, subtle yet decisive. It allows the longship to slice through waves rather than crash against them. The flexible hull distributes stress across its length. In winter seas, that resilience becomes a quiet guardian. There has been considerable academic debate about how representative burial ships are of everyday working vessels. Some researchers argue that ships placed in elite graves may have been more ornate or carefully constructed than typical seafaring craft. Others suggest that even utilitarian ships displayed high standards of workmanship, reflecting a culture deeply invested in maritime excellence. The truth likely lies in careful nuance. You crouch and examine the seam where two planks overlap. The caulking made from animal hair and tar remains firm. In freezing conditions, such sealing prevents icy water from seeping into the bilge. Without it, dampness would accumulate beneath your feet, compounding the cold. A fascinating yet lesser known detail from archaeological studies reveals that some ship timbers were selected from naturally curved branches rather than cut and bent into shape. This preserved the strength of the wood grain, enhancing durability. You imagine the careful search through forests for the right curve, the right bend. The woman kneels nearby, inspecting a rope loop for fraying. The boy gathers small stones to reinforce the makeshift firing. Even on this rugged shore, maintenance continues. Scholars continue to explore how shipbuilding knowledge was transmitted across generations. There are no surviving written manuals from the Viking Age detailing construction techniques. Instead, expertise appears to have been passed orally and through apprenticeship. Master builders likely trained younger craftsmen, embedding knowledge in practice rather than parchment. You rise and step back to take in the full silhouette of the longship resting against stone and sand. Its narrow form appears almost fragile against the vast landscape, yet it has carried you safely through freezing nights and biting wind. A small anecdote recorded in modern reconstructions of Viking vessels describes how even minor design details, such as the angle of the stem and stern posts, influence how a ship sheds spray in rough weather. Such subtleties may not have been articulated in technical language centuries ago, yet they were understood intuitively by builders and sailors alike. The fire crackles to life as driftwood catches flame. Warmth spreads outwards, slowly illuminating the hull in flickering gold. The planks glow softly, revealing grain patterns beneath tar. There has been ongoing scholarly reflection on how maritime innovation contributed to Norse expansion across the North Atlantic. Some historians emphasize navigational skill, others highlight ship design as the decisive factor. It is likely that both intertwined, supported by cultural values that encouraged exploration. You extend your hands toward the fire and feel sensation return to stiff fingers. Behind you, the sea continues its steady murmur against rock. The longship rests, but is not idle. It is a testament to accumulated knowledge refined through trial and adaptation. Its structure compensates for the lack of permanent shelter by offering flexibility and strength. You walk its length once more, checking for cracks or damage from the rocky landing. There are none significant. The vessel remains sound. Winter survival on these voyages is not accidental. It is built into every plank and rivet, every overlapping board, every carefully sealed seam. As night approaches again, you feel a quiet gratitude for the craftsmanship that supports your endurance. Without these bones of oak and iron wool, and courage would not suffice. The boy sits near the fire, eyes reflecting its glow. The woman adjusts her cloak and studies the darkening sky. The older man with the cough rests more comfortably, now fever reduced. You settle near the hull, leaning back against its curved side. The fire's warmth meets the residual chill from the sea. Archaeology reveals the tangible remnants of ships long buried. You experience the living reality of one still afloat, and as flames flicker against tarred wood and winter stars begin to appear overhead, you recognize that survival here is not only about immediate adaptation, it is the result of generations who shaped wood into vessels capable of meeting cold seas with quiet confidence. The next days carry you farther west than you have ever travelled in winter. The air feels different here, thinner, somehow edged with a clarity that makes the horizon seem almost sharpened by frost. The sea deepens in colour, turning a darker steel blue beneath the low sun. You stand at the bow and peer ahead. Far in the distance, a pale line appears against the sky. At first it looks like cloud, then you realize it is land rimmed with something brighter. Snow that has not melted. Perhaps it never fully does. Greenland. It is firmly grounded in historical research that Norse settlers established colonies in Greenland around the late 10th century. These communities endured for centuries in an environment that tested the limits of agricultural survival. Winter there was not merely cold, it was long, relentless, and isolating. As the Longship approaches this stark coastline, you feel a new layer of awareness settle over you. Nights on the open deck have been harsh enough. What must it be like to anchor near a land where frost claims the ground for months at a time? Scholars continue to examine how Norse settlers adapted to Greenland's severe climate. Some emphasize the careful management of livestock and limited farmland in sheltered fjords. Others point to reliance on hunting and trade with indigenous Inuit communities. The historical picture remains complex, shaped by archaeology and fragmentary records. You imagine winter nights here when the sea freezes along the edges of inlets and the wind sweeps unobstructed across ice fields. The sail canopy that shielded you earlier might seem fragile against such vast cold. A modest but intriguing detail from excavations in Greenland reveals that Norse settlers built turf houses with thick walls using earth as insulation against freezing air. Compared to the openness of your Longship, such dwellings must have felt almost luxurious. Yet reaching those sheltered homes required voyages like this one. The journey itself was a test before settlement began. There has been sustained debate among historians about why the Greenland colonies eventually declined and vanished. Some researchers argue that climate cooling during the Little Ice Age played a significant role. Others suggest economic isolation and reduced trade with Europe contributed more decisively. The reasons remain layered and debated. You watch as ice fragments drift past the hull, small and scattered. They tap softly against wood before sliding away. The water here feels heavier, colder, as if infused with ancient chill. The crew moves with heightened attention. Landing in unfamiliar icy conditions demands precision. The helmsman adjusts course slightly to avoid thicker patches of floating ice. A curious anecdote from later Norse accounts describes sailors listening for subtle changes in the sound of water against the hull to detect nearby ice beneath the surface. Whether such skill was widespread or exceptional remains uncertain, but the idea underscores the heightened awareness required in these waters. You pull your cloak tighter and draw a slow breath. The cold here feels less negotiable. It does not fluctuate gently between manageable and sharp, it holds steady deep. The boy stands beside you, eyes wide at the sight of distant white cliffs. The woman scans the coastline thoughtfully, perhaps imagining settlement or safe harbour. It's widely recognised that Greenland's Norse settlements relied heavily on maritime travel to maintain contact with Iceland and Norway. Even in harsh conditions, ships like yours crossed these waters. Survival was not limited to brief voyages, it extended into sustained habitation. As dusk approaches, the sky takes on a faint rose hue above the snow-rimmed land. The Longship slows, searching for a sheltered inlet where it might anchor. You consider how far human adaptability can stretch. From wooded Scandinavian fjords to this stark frozen coast, the same vessel carries you. The same layers of wool shield your skin, the same shared warmth binds the crew. Yet the environment grows more severe with each mile. Historians continue to explore the limits of Norse resilience in Greenland, weighing environmental evidence against cultural factors. Some argue that a rigid adherence to familiar farming practices hindered adaptation. Others suggest that environmental shifts simply overwhelmed even the most prepared communities. As the anchor is lowered cautiously into icy water, you feel both awe and humility. Winter here is not a passing season, it is a defining force. You settle once more along the bench, aware that tonight's cold may cut deeper than those before. Yet you remain as do the others. The Longship rests at the edge of a land that challenges endurance at every level, and as the pale light fades behind snow-streaked cliffs, you understand that survival on freezing winter nights is not only about immediate shelter, it is about pushing into landscapes where shelter itself must be reimagined. The inlet you have chosen offers only partial protection. Jagged rock rises on one side and a shelf of ice clings stubbornly to the shaded bank. The anchor holds, but the water around the hull carries thin shards that knock softly against the planks. As dusk deepens, the question returns with renewed urgency. How do you create warmth here, where even driftwood is scarce and the air seems carved from stone? You gather near the centre of the deck, speaking in low voices about the possibility of heat. On earlier shores, a modest fire pit offered relief. Here the ground is hard and frozen and the wind sweeps unpredictably between rock faces. It's firmly supported by archaeological evidence that Norse settlers in Greenland used soapstone vessels to contain heat effectively. Soapstone resists cracking under temperature changes, and retains warmth for extended periods. While your longship carries no built-in hearth, it may hold portable stone containers for cooking when ashore. You retrieve a small stone bowl from stored provisions, running your hand along its smooth, cool surface. If heated carefully, it could radiate warmth beneath the sail canopy without open flame licking at tarred wood. There has been long-standing academic debate about whether braziers were ever used aboard longships during extreme cold. Some researchers argue that the risk of fire would have discouraged such practices, except under controlled conditions ashore. Others suggest that carefully managed embers in stone containers might have been feasible in calm-anchored situations. The historical record does not provide a definitive answer. You kneel and consider the options. A fire on this rocky bank would require breaking ice and digging into frozen soil. The wind would scatter sparks easily. A curious detail from experimental voyages in northern waters notes that heated stones wrapped in cloth can provide significant warmth without open flame acting as primitive heat reservoirs. You recall the heated stone placed near your feet on a previous shore. The memory feels especially appealing now. The crew decides on caution. A small fire will be lit on the most sheltered patch of rock shielded by a hastily assembled barrier of stones. Driftwood is scarce, but scraps from previous landings and a few carried pieces will suffice for a brief blaze. You work together, hands stiff but determined. The fire catches slowly, flames low and controlled. The soapstone bowl is placed near the edge to warm gradually. Scholars continue to examine how Norse communities balance the constant need for warmth against the equally constant threat of fire in wooden structures. Turf houses reduced that risk ashore. Aboard ship, restraint and ingenuity were paramount. The boy watches closely as the stone darkens with heat. The woman adjusts the barrier to deflect wind. The older man rests nearby, wrapped tightly in wool. Once the stone holds sufficient warmth, you transfer it carefully onto a thick layer of cloth and carry it beneath the sail canopy. The fabric above traps some of the rising heat. It is modest, subtle, but tangible. There is something deeply reassuring about warmth that does not flicker or roar. The stone glows faintly in the dim light, releasing stored energy slowly. A lesser-known anecdote preserved in later Scandinavian rural tradition describes families passing heated stones between beds during severe winters as sharing warmth in the absence of large fires. Whether this custom dates directly to the Viking Age is uncertain, yet it reflects a practical continuity in northern survival strategies. You settle along the bench, positioning the warmed stone near your feet. The heat seeps upward through wool and leather, reaching skin gradually. Outside ice taps gently against the hull. The wind hums along rock faces. There has been ongoing scholarly reflection on how technological simplicity shaped Norse adaptation. Without metal stoves or insulated cabins, solutions remained elemental. Stone, wool, proximity. You draw your cloak tighter and watch faint steam rise where the stone's warmth meets cold air. Tonight shelter is improvised once more, not through permanent walls but through cautious fire, retained heat and shared vigilance. The longship rests in icy water at the edge of a severe land, yet beneath the sail canopy a pocket of warmth persists. As your eyes grow heavy, you recognize that survival here is not dramatic defiance, it is careful calculation. A flame shielded from wind, a stone heated just enough, a canopy stretched low against the cold. And in that measured balance between fire and frost you find another night possible. The days grow incrementally harsher as you linger near this frozen coast. The wind carries a sharper edge and the light seems thinner as though filtered through endless layers of ice. Yet what strikes you most is not the cold itself, but the way it tests leadership. You watch the chieftain move along the deck, speaking quietly with each member of the crew. He does not shout, he does not posture, instead he observes. He checks the tension of ropes, the condition of cloaks, the steadiness of the boys' hands. Authority here is not theatrical, it is steady. It's broadly supported by historical research that Viking expeditions were often led by individuals whose authority rested on a blend of wealth, reputation, and personal capability. Leadership at sea demanded more than bravery. It required judgment in weather navigation and morale. In winter, those qualities became even more critical. You notice how the chieftain assigns watches with care, ensuring that no one stands too long in the cold. He directs the warming of stones, methodically conserving limited fuel. When the older man coughs again, he adjusts the rotation to grant him more rest without drawing attention to weakness. There has been significant scholarly discussion about how hierarchical structures functioned aboard longships. Some historians argue that social rank remained clearly defined even at sea. Others suggest that the practical demands of sailing blurred certain distinctions, emphasizing competence over birthright. As you observe the quiet efficiency on deck, you sense that survival favors those who act wisely rather than those who merely command loudly. The The boy glances toward the chieftain often, as if measuring himself against an invisible standard. The woman consults with him briefly about rationing provisions. Their exchange is brief but purposeful. A curious anecdote preserved in a later Scandinavian saga describes a leader who deliberately shared the coldest watch with his crew during a brutal winter voyage, reinforcing solidarity through shared hardship. Whether literal or symbolic, the story reflects a cultural expectation that leaders endure alongside those they guide. The Longship shifts gently at anchor ice, nudging against the hull. The chieftain walks its length once more before dusk settles fully. He runs his hand along the mast tests and not nods once. There has been ongoing academic reflection on how Norse leadership adapted in colonial contexts such as Greenland. Some scholars suggest that strong local governance helped settlements endure environmental strain. Others argue that rigid hierarchies may have hindered flexibility in the face of climate change. The historical narrative remains complex. You feel the weight of responsibility ripple outward from the chieftain's steady presence. His composure tempers anxiety. His decisiveness curbs hesitation. As night approaches, he gathers the crew briefly. His words are measured, reminding everyone of tasks for the coming hours. No grand speeches, no dramatic proclamations, just clarity. The wind intensifies slightly, whistling through narrow gaps in the rock face. The sail canopy is secured firmly, edges tightened against sudden gusts. You take your assigned position along the bench, noting that the chieftain chooses a place not far from the coldest edge of the deck. He lies down without ceremony, cloak drawn close. Scholars continue to explore how authority in Viking society was maintained not solely through force, but through reciprocal loyalty. Successful leaders distributed resources, resolved disputes, and demonstrated competence. Winter at sea amplifies these expectations. The boy curls near the centre, shielded by overlapping cloaks. The woman adjusts a heated stone once more. The older man rests more comfortably tonight. You glance toward this chieftain. His eyes remain open a moment longer than most, scanning the dark horizon beyond the bow. Only when he seems satisfied does he close them. Leadership here does not eliminate cold, it does not banish wind or quiet the ice tapping at the hull, but it provides structure, a sense that each decision is deliberate rather than desperate. The Longship rests against a frozen shore crew bound together by necessity and shared direction. As you settle into the narrow curve of wood once more, you understand that winter survival depends not only on wool and fire, but on the steady hand guarding both. And in the hush that follows beneath a sky, dimmed by drifting cloud, the ship holds firm, anchored not just by rope and stone, but by the calm authority that keeps fear from unraveling into chaos. The night settles heavily over the frozen inlet, and with it comes a different kind of warmth. Not from fire or stone, but from belief. You lie awake for a while, listening as the wind threads itself between rock and sailcloth. The heated stone near your feet has cooled to a faint memory. The sea taps gently at the hull where ice allows it passage. Beyond that, silence. Then softly a voice begins to speak. It is not conversation. It is rhythm, a murmur shaped by repetition. You turn your head slightly and see the woman's lips moving, breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She traces a shape against her cloak with her finger, perhaps a symbol known only to her. It's well established that during the Viking Age, Norse belief systems blended reverence for gods such as Odin and Thor with local customs and protective charms. Ritual and prayer were woven into daily life, including voyages at sea. Protection was sought not only through preparation, but through invocation. The voice continues quietly, Sas, not loud enough to disturb those sleeping, but steady enough to be heard by those still awake. The words may be a simple plea for safe passage, or perhaps a recitation of a familiar verse learned in childhood. There has been sustained academic exploration of how spiritual belief influenced maritime practices. Some historians argue that rituals before departure, offerings cast into the sea, or symbolic carvings on prows were essential psychological anchors. Others suggest that practical seamanship outweighed spiritual considerations, and that ritual served more as cultural expression than functional necessity. The balance between faith and skill remains an area of thoughtful inquiry. You glance toward the carved figurehead at the bow, barely visible in the dark. Its shape once seemed fierce, almost aggressive. Now it feels like a silent sentinel. A small yet fascinating detail preserved in certain medieval sources describes sailors carrying small amulets carved from bone or wood etched with runes believed to guard against misfortune. Whether such objects were common aboard longships is uncertain, but archaeological finds of rune-inscribed items suggest that personal charms were not unusual in Norse society. The boy stirs and opens his ears, briefly listening. He does not speak, but his breathing steadies as the murmur continues. You feel something shift within you. The cold remains sharp, the wind still presses against sail and cloak, Yet the quiet recitation softens the atmosphere like an invisible canopy layered over the physical one. Scholars continue to examine how the transition from Norse paganism to Christianity affected maritime rituals in later centuries. Some evidence suggests that prayers evolved, names changed, but the underlying impulse remained. Sailors in any age seek reassurance when confronting vast indifferent seas. The older man with the cough shifts slightly, his breath less strained tonight. Perhaps the steady voice comforts him as well. A curious anecdote recorded in a later Icelandic text recounts sailors carving small crosses into the mast after conversion to Christianity, blending new faith with old ship. Whether this practice was symbolic or devotional remains debated, yet it reflects continuity of belief adapting to circumstance. You close your eyes and let the murmured words wash over you. You do not need to understand each syllable. The rhythm alone carries meaning. Winter survival on this longship has required wool fire, careful maintenance, shared heat, disciplined watches, and measured leadership. Yet here is another layer, an appeal to forces beyond wind and ice. You consider your own quiet hopes, safe landing, clear skies, strength to endure another night. The voice fades gradually, tapering into silence. No grand conclusion, no dramatic invocation, just a final breath released into the cold air. The wind continues, the ice taps gently at the hull. The longship rests anchored between rock and frozen water. Belief does not warm your skin directly. It does not seal planks or thaw rope, but it steadies the mind, and a steady mind conserves energy that panic would waste. There has been thoughtful reflection among historians on the role of communal ritual in maintaining morale during harsh conditions. Shared belief, whether in God's fate or collective destiny, reinforces cohesion. You draw your cloak closer and shift slightly toward the warmth of those beside you. The night deepens, yet feels less oppressive than before. Not because the cold has lessened, but because it has been acknowledged, addressed in whispered words. And as sleep begins to claim you gently, you sense that survival here rests not only on tangible sill, but also on the quiet conviction that you are not entirely alone beneath this frozen sky. Morning comes almost reluctantly, a pale shimmer along the edge of snow-streaked cliffs. You wake to a different sound this time. Not wind, not cough, not the steady murmur of ice against wood. Drip. At first is faint, irregular, then it comes again, small drop of water falling from the edge of the sail onto the deck. You push yourself upright and look toward the shoreline. The air feels marginally softer. The cold has not vanished, but it has shifted. The sky carries a faint wash of gold that was absent in previous days. You stand carefully and step towards the bow. Along the rock face, thin rivulets of meltwater trace dark lines through snow. Ice that had gripped the shoreline so tightly now glistens at its edges. It is well documented in climate studies that even in harsh northern winters, brief thaws can occur when wind patterns change or sunlight strengthens slightly. These temporary respites do not signal the end of winter, but they offer moments of relief. You crouch and touch the deck where snow once lingered stubbornly. The surface feels damp rather than frozen solid. The shift is subtle, yet unmistakable. The crew notices too. The boy smiles openly at the sight of dripping icicles along the rock. The woman tilts her face toward the faint warmth in the air. Even the older man rises with dibre, yet less stiffness in his movements. There has been considerable scholarly analysis of how Norse settlers in Greenland monitored seasonal shifts, closely relying on subtle environmental cues to determine when travel or hunting might resume. Timing was everything. A slight thaw could open a narrow window for movement. A curious detail from medieval Icelandic texts describes farmers listening for the first distinct drip from roof eaves as a sign that spring might be approaching. While poetic, such attentiveness to minor changes reflects a culture deeply attuned to climate. You move along the hull and inspect the planks. Frost that once clung stubbornly now melts into small beads of water. You wipe them away instinctively, preventing seepage into seams. The ice floating near the anchor has thinned slightly. Fragments drift apart more easily. The sea appears darker where open water widens. Historians continue to debate how much climatic fluctuation influenced Norse exploration patterns. Some researchers suggest that relatively milder conditions during parts of the medieval warm period facilitated voyages to Greenland and beyond. Others caution that regional variability complicates any simple narrative. Climate is rarely uniform across centuries. You inhale deeply, separating the faint difference in the air. It is still cold enough to bite, but the edge has softened. The chieftain surveys the inlet, carefully calculating whether departure might be safer today than yesterday. His gaze lingers on the widening channel between ice and rock. The goat shifts and shakes its head, dislodging small droplets from its fur. The boy laughs quietly at the sight, the sound light and unguarded. There is a subtle lift in morale, not exuberance but renewed energy. The prospect of movement feels tangible again. A small anecdote preserved in later Scandinavian writing recounts sailors celebrating the first clear thaw by raising a brief cheer, mindful not to tempt fate with excessive joy. You resist the urge to cheer, yet you feel the same impulse stirring within you. Winter does not vanish overnight. Snow still crowns the cliffs. The wind may yet turn cruel again, but this moment of melting carries significance. You help dismantle the sail canopy and prepare the anchor line. The deck, though damp, no longer glitters with frost. The longship shifts slightly as the tide changes. Open water beckons beyond the inlet. Scholars continue to explore how communities in harsh climates balanced patience with readiness, knowing that opportunity often arrives quietly and departs quickly. You stand at the bow and watch as sunlight touches the highest ridge, igniting snow into a brief blaze of gold. The drip continues steady now, water returning to motion. Survival on freezing winter nights has required vigilance, cooperation, faith and restraint. Now it asks something else. Timing. As the anchor is raised carefully and the hull nudges free from lingering ice, you feel a quiet sense of accomplishment. Not triumph over a winter, but coexistence with it. The longship glides once more into open water, leaving behind the frozen inlet. And as sunlight strengthens incrementally against your face, you recognize that endurance is not about defeating the cold, it is about waiting, watching and moving when the moment allows. The sea feels different now. Not warm, not gentle, but altered in a way you can sense in your bones. The longship cuts through widening lanes of open water ice, drifting farther apart with each measured stroke of the oars. The air still carries winter's breath, yet the edge has softened just enough to suggest movement rather than entrapment. You stand near the bow and let the pale sunlight rest on your face. It does not heat your skin dramatically, but it reminds you that cold is not permanent. Behind you lie nights of frost-rimmed planks, stiff ropes shared breath, beneath woolen turbid sails, heated stones cradled like small suns in the dark. It's firmly grounded in historical understanding that the Viking age was defined by mobility. These were not people who waited passively for seasons to change. They adapted, travelled, endured. Longships allowed them to inhabit thresholds between land and sea, between settlement and exploration, even between freezing night and thawing dawn. You think back to your first step onto this deck when the absence of shelter felt almost impossible. No cabin, no hearth, just open sky and exposed wood. And yet night after night you found ways to remain, layer upon layer of wool, body pressed to body. Watches rotated with discipline, ice chipped from rope before it bound too tightly. Fires lit carefully ashore, stones warmed and passed like quiet treasures. There has been considerable scholarly reflection on how such adaptability shaped Norse identity. Some historians argue that environmental pressure forged a culture of resilience and innovation. Others caution against oversimplifying, noting that many societies in harsh climates develop similar traits. Still, the maritime dimension of Norse life remains distinctive. The boy stands beside you, now no longer quite as uncertain as he was. The woman adjusts a line near the mast with practiced ease. The older man breathes more steadily, his cough reduced to an occasional rasp. The chieftain watches the horizon with calm focus. A lesser-known yet compelling observation from archaeological research suggests that the success of longship voyages lay not only in bold crossings but in cumulative knowledge. Small improvements in sail weave, slight refinements in hull curvature, adjustments to provisioning and layering. Survival was not heroic spectacle. It was incremental mastery. You rest your hand against the hull and feel the faint vibration of water against wood. This vessel has carried you through wind that sliced like a blade, through snow that blanketed deck and rope, through nights when darkness pressed heavily against thought. Scholars continue to examine how memory of such voyages was preserved and reshaped in later centuries. Saga literature magnified certain aspects, softened others. Modern imagination has added its own gloss. But beneath embellishment lies the steady truth of human endurance. You inhale deeply and taste salt, faint and familiar. The coastline ahead looks less severe than the frozen cliffs behind. Patches of brown earth appear between lingering snowfields. A small flock of birds wheels overhead, their calls bright against the muted sea. Winter has not vanished, but it has loosened its grip. You lower yourself onto the bench one final time and lean back against the curved planks. The wood feels less hostile now, almost companionable. You close your eyes briefly and let the rhythm of the hull steady your breath. Survival on freezing winter nights without shelter has never been about defiance. It has been about relationship, between wool and wind, between fire and restraint, between leader and crew, between belief and skill. You have learned to read ice before it hardens to clear snow, before it weighs too heavily to share warmth before cold isolates. You have learned that a sail can become a roof, that a stone can become a hearth, that a narrow bench can cradle sleep when trust binds those who lie upon it. The longship continues forward, no longer trapped by ice, yet still guided by the same principles that sustained you in the darkest hours. The sky lightens further, the sea opens, and as you sit quietly feeling both the memory of frost and the promise of movement, you understand that endurance leaves no grand monument. It leaves habits, skills, stories carried in breath and bone. You pull your cloak around your shoulders once more, not out of desperation now, but familiarity. The cold wind brushes your cheek softer than before. The longship glides onward, and you remain steady and awake within it, carrying the quiet knowledge that even without shelter, winter can be survived when wood, wool, and human will align against the night. Now the sea grows gentler in your mind. The ice drifts farther away. The deck beneath you feels firm but not harsh. The wind becomes a low whisper rather than a blade. You imagine the sail above you, hanging still, catching only the faintest breath of air. Your hands are warm now, your breath slow. The long nights you endured soften into memory like frost melting into cloyes of clear water. You picture the heated stone resting by your feet, the overlapping cloaks forming a quiet canopy, the steady watch beneath distant stars. There is no urgency here anymore, only rhythm. The hull rocks gently, the sea hums low and even, the sky above is pale and wide. You let your shoulders sink, let your jaw unclench, let the cold recede into something manageable, almost distant. The voyage continues, but you do not need to follow every motion now. Just rest within the steady sway of wood on water. Rest within the shared warmth you helped create. Rest knowing that winter, however sharp, does not last forever. And as the longship drifts through calm open sea beneath a softening sky, you let your thoughts slow to match the tide. Sleep comes easily here. Sweet dream? Reams.